Was I expelled from Hogwarts? Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 376 Hermione, Ralph, you kept me up all night. Creating a Horcrux requires 2 steps, killing someone and then tearing apart one's own soul. The entire process is extremely evil and can affect the wizard's mental state, intellect, and even appearance. Voldemort is a prime example. Therefore, wizards who can create Horcruxes are undoubtedly evil dark wizards. And since that basilisk is a Horcrux and is still alive, it means its creator is still alive. One Voldemort is already difficult enough to deal with, adding a dark wizard who created a Horcrux would be unbearable. Similarly, Ralph and Corvinus Gaunt's deal had to be terminated. After all, there was a mole. Back in his dormitory, Ralph lay in bed, thinking for a long time before finally falling asleep. The alarm rang several times the next morning, but he didn't get up. Instead, he turned it off and went back to sleep comfortably. Just before class, he quickly got up, washed up, ate breakfast in the kitchen, and then hurriedly went to class with Neville. The first class of the new semester was Professor Binns' History of Magic, which Hufflepuff and Gryffindor attended together. Upon arriving at the classroom, the two quickly spotted Hermione in the crowd and headed towards her. Normally, Hermione would already be taking out her textbook and preparing for class, but today, unusually, she was napping at her desk. After Ralph sat down, she opened her eyes and glared at the boy with a death stare. Ralph looked back and was startled to see Hermione with dark circles under her eyes, looking utterly exhausted, as if she hadn't slept all night. He lowered his voice and asked, "Hermione, did you go for a night stroll last night?" "Who went for a night stroll?" Hermione snorted softly, suppressing her sleepiness, resting her chin on the back of her hand. "Only you would do something that violates school rules. Then why do you look so sleepy? Isn't it because of you?" Hermione raised her voice, huffing, "You kept me up all night. Hey, you can drink potions however you want, but you can't say whatever you want. Who kept you up last night?" Hermione's voice wasn't quiet, attracting the attention of many students. The girl realized the ambiguity in her words, her face flushing as she quickly explained, "You only said half of what you said last night, which piqued my curiosity. I kept thinking about it after I got back to my dorm, and the more I thought about it, the less I could sleep, staying up most of the night." "Isn't that a bit strange?" Ralph chuckled. Hermione's curiosity was too strong. Next time he teased her, he'd have a new way to get back at her. Laughing, "You're still laughing," Hermione snapped, annoyed by the boy's gloating. "Why don't you just grin all the way to your ears? I can't exactly cry, can I?" Ralph, hands in his sleeves, leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. "Don't get excited, I'll tell you about Peter Pettigrew. You're waiting for me to tell you?" "I don't even need breakfast," Hermione puffed out her cheeks. "I already asked Sherry this morning. By the way, I told you to come earlier this morning. Why are you so late?" "Sleeping," Ralph shrugged. "I slept until after 8, thinking about how she'd gotten up at 6, and seeing Ralph sitting there, full of energy and reading." Hermione's eyes filled with resentment. She reached out and grabbed Crookshank's paws, saying, "Crookshank, bite him." Forced interaction. Crookshank didn't fall for it. Instead, rolling his eyes at his master, "If I bite and it hurts, you're blaming me. You bite him yourself. You know how to control the pressure." The school bell rang quickly, and Professor Binns emerged from the wall to begin today's lesson. Although Professor Binns was dead and a ghost, he could still wield the most powerful area of effect magic. He hypnotized the students into collective slumber in just 30 seconds, a feat that even the experienced Dumbledore would likely admire. Indeed, Hogwarts was a place teeming with hidden talents. But Professor Binns seemed quite self-satisfied, swaying his head and drawing out his words as he continued his narration of medieval magical history. This semester, they had already covered King Arthur's unification of Britain with the help of the famous wizard Merlin. Now they were discussing the story of the 4 great wizards and Hogwarts. Not long after Ravenclaw's death, Gryffindor also left Hogwarts. Of the 4 great masters, Only Hufflepuff remained, and she was also Hogwarts' first headmistress. Back then, each house ate in its own common room. Hufflepuff reformed the education system, making all students eat in the Great Hall. To address fights between students, Madame Hufflepuff established a strict point system, with a winner receiving the House Cup. Most of our current systems are derived from Madame Hufflepuff. It was clear that Professor Binns liked Hufflepuff very much, constantly praising her. Of course, he also highly regarded Ravenclaw. As for Gryffindor and Slytherin, his comments were mostly derogatory. It was as if Hogwarts' success was solely due to Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff, and those two useless men. The story of the four great masters was originally very engaging, but because of Professor Binns's teaching style, the students all fell asleep, even Hermione. After all, she hadn't slept well last night because of Ralph's antics. But Hermione, having slept through most of the class, suddenly woke up with a start. How did Peter Pettigrew know the location of Nicholas Flamel's manor? Ralph, who was taking notes, was stunned. You're thinking about this while you're sleeping. I don't know. Nicholas himself didn't find out either. What, do you have a guess? Hermione opened one eye, rubbing her cheeks with both hands. Ralph, do you think Peter and Voldemort found out from that female reporter named Rita Skeeter? Ralph stopped writing, narrowing his eyes. Why do you think it was her? The summer before last, she reported on your visit to Nicholas Flamel's manor, and I've been following her ever since, Hermione whispered. That photo of you two was also published by her first in the newspaper. That woman seems to have excellent connections. She might know the location of the manor. Ralph seemed thoughtful, lightly tapping his forehead with his quill. The summer before last, many famous wizards appeared in London, heading to Nicholas's manor for a funeral. This must have caught Rita Skeeter's attention, especially since she can transform into a beetle and crawl on people. Although she couldn't enter the manor, she could pinpoint the approximate location. Hermione, you're so clever. Ralph gave her a thumbs up, sincerely praising her. It's definitely possible, very likely. Hermione smiled happily, revealing her two prominent front teeth. Before the girl could say anything more, Professor Binns floated over with a grim face. Everyone else was sleeping peacefully. And you two were whispering here, that was too much? Professor Binns stared at Ralph and said sternly, Scatty, shut up. Slytherin, deduct 10 points. Chapter 377 Wolfsbane Potion. This was his third year taking History of Magic, and although it was always Slytherin's house points that got deducted, which was quite satisfying, after a while, Ralph would still correct Professor Binns. His name isn't Scatty, it's Scamander, but for some reason, despite being corrected many times, Professor Binns would still get the name wrong. One could only assume that this Slytherin student named Scatty was as handsome as Ralph and owed Professor Binns a lot of money, otherwise he wouldn't be so persistent. After class, Ralph didn't leave immediately but stayed behind and asked, Professor Binns, there are some things about History of Magic that I don't understand, and I'd like to ask you a question. For the first time in hundreds of years, a student had asked him a question after class, and Professor Binns' long-dormant soul suddenly stirred slightly. Oh, what's the problem, Mr. Scatty? I saw you just say in class that Lady Rowena Ravenclaw died of illness, and Bathilda Bagshot's History of Magic also says so. Ralph paused, lowering his voice, but I've heard another version, that Ravenclaw was killed by other wizards. You and she were colleagues back then, did you know that? Professor Binns paused for a moment, staring intently at Ralph, as if he had never really looked at this student before. Who told you that, Ms. Gray? That is, Helena Ravenclaw, Ralph whispered. She said you told her the news. Did I tell her? Professor Binns's eyes became confused, and he tried to recall. It's been too long, I can't remember many things from before. Think again. Professor Binns stared at Ralph. It seems like a student told me back then. Which student? Ralph asked excitedly. Professor Binns was silent for a moment, then shook his head. It's been almost 1,000 years. How could I possibly remember? Well, even if he did remember, that student would be long dead. His bones probably turned to ash. Ralph sighed and inquired about Slytherin again. The basilisk belonged to Slytherin, so it was highly likely he had made a Horcrux from it. But Professor Binns knew nothing, and Ralph didn't get much useful information. He had no choice but to hurry to the potions classroom. He could be late for anyone's class, but not Snape's. When Ralph arrived at the classroom, he saw a cauldron emitting purple smoke on the podium. Professor Snape stood beside the cauldron, holding a silver knife, processing a brightly colored flower. Ralph sat down next to Sherry and asked softly, "What's going on?" "I don't know either." Sherry shook her head. "When I came to the classroom, I saw Professor Snape brewing potions." Ralph narrowed his eyes. Snape had never brewed potions in class before. This was the first time. Looking at the purple magical plants arranged on the workbench, Ralph murmured, "That's wolfsbane." Wolfsbane, also known as citron wolfsbane, is a poisonous magical plant with analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties, and is the main ingredient in wolfsbane potions. Of course, it also has a unique name, heartbreak grass. After accidentally ingesting a love potion, taking heartbreak grass can be used to counteract its effects. This was a miraculous effect that Newt discovered years ago. He had previously tried to breed nearly extinct horned beasts, but when they didn't cooperate, he resorted to using a love potion. Once, Newt accidentally ingested a love potion himself and unexpectedly discovered that heartbreak grass had a miraculous effect, helping him to overcome the abnormal state. As for how Newt resisted the effects of the love potion before taking heartbreak grass, Ralph dared not say, nor dared to ask. The young wizards were all seeing Snape brewing potions for the first time, and they couldn't help but stare at him. Snape's knife skills were truly excellent. He chopped so much wolfsbane grass quickly and steadily, each piece of herb cut as fine as a hair. Such skillful hands, it's a real shame they're not cooks, at least they were great at shredding potatoes. After placing the wolfsbane into the cauldron, Snape looked at the students through the rising steam, his voice icy. Who knows how to deal with a werewolf? This question was clearly beyond their comprehension. The students fell silent, no one answering him. Nobody knows. Snape's face wore a mocking smile. "I never imagined third-year students wouldn't know how to deal with werewolves. Professor Snape, we haven't learned about werewolves yet." Hannah raised her hand to answer. "We've been practicing the Patronus charm lately," Snape scoffed. "That only shows you're lagging behind in defense against the dark arts." "I'll write that down and tell Professor Dumbledore. Perhaps Professor Black has been in Azkaban for too long and isn't up to the task yet. We need a more experienced teacher to replace him." "But Professor Black is the best defense against the dark arts teacher we've ever had," Susan muttered softly. The rest of the class murmured in agreement. Snape's face hardened with a sinister expression. He sneered, "You're all easily satisfied, but Professor Black has indeed been holding back, not teaching you his most proficient magic." "What magic, Professor Snape?" Padma Petty of Ravenclaw asked curiously. "How to identify and deal with werewolves," Snape grinned maliciously. "Black is a werewolf expert. You might not know, but during his school years, he had a relationship with a werewolf that went beyond friendship, an illicit affair that lasted for over a decade. No one knows werewolves better than him." Professor Snape paced slowly around the classroom, saying gently, "Perhaps in your next defense against the dark arts class, you can ask him how to kill a werewolf." "Don't miss such a good opportunity," everyone began to whisper, clearly discussing who this werewolf with Professor Black's illicit relationship was. "So, who can tell me how to deal with werewolves?" Snape looked at Ralph and said, "Scamander, you recently killed a werewolf. Perhaps you could share some experience." All the students turned to look at Ralph. Last summer, he had killed the infamous werewolf Fenrir Greyback. Everyone knew about it. Werewolves in wolf form have high magic resistance and defense, and they're very fast. Fighting them head-on is a very unwise move. Ralph stood up and said, "If you know the revert to human form charm, you can temporarily turn a werewolf back into a human. That's a good method. Wielding a sharp blade, like a goblin-made dagger or sword, can also pierce their skin. Of course, there's another way. Give the werewolf a potion of wolfsbane." "That's right," Snape grinned. "Wolfsbane potion. This is the potion I'm going to teach you to brew in this class." "This isn't something we can brew, is it?" Hannah questioned softly. "Even many potions masters couldn't." "It's all right, I don't expect you to be able to brew it." Snape lowered his voice, saying, "But Professor Dumbledore asked me to help brew a wolfsbane potion for a werewolf. The headmaster is in a hurry, so if you have a decent wolfsbane potion, I'll give it to him first." Everyone gasped. Were you brewing a wolfsbane potion, or were you trying to poison that werewolf? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 378 Shirley, I was first. Werewolves are terrifying creatures who transform during the full moon and indiscriminately attack other humans. Those bitten either die or are infected and transformed into new werewolves, who then attack others, a vicious cycle. Therefore, a potion that can prevent werewolves from transforming, or at least preserve their rationality after transformation, has been urgently needed. The advent of wolfsbane potion undoubtedly alleviated this problem. Of course, it was only an alleviation. The reason is simple: wolfsbane potion is extremely difficult to brew. The steps alone could fill 2 blackboards. Its difficulty is evident. Therefore, this potion is indeed outside the student's curriculum, severely beyond their studies. Beyond being beyond the curriculum, most of the ingredients for brewing the potion are poisonous. Wolfsbane is a given. White snake root, when consumed, causes a condition called mastitis, which many witches use to enhance their breasts. There's also the infamous hemlock, an ingredient found in the poison wine that Socrates drank. The young wizards, despite their heavy protective gear, hesitated to brew it, fearing that even a small amount of poison would lead to their untimely death. Snape frowned and urged, "What's there to be afraid of? The dosage is so small, and you're wearing gloves. As long as you don't swallow it directly, nothing will happen. In fact, absorbing a small amount of toxin is good for your health." This reminded Ralph of his chemistry teacher from his previous life. When the students were afraid of being poisoned during chemistry experiments, he would comfort them by saying, "Doing more chemistry experiments is good for your health. When I was a child, I had rhinitis that I couldn't cure no matter what I tried. Later, I went to the lab and inhaled ammonia for a while, and my rhinitis gradually got better." His rhinitis did indeed get better, but he went bald. Under Snape's repeated urging, the young wizards had no choice but to get to work and reluctantly began brewing the wolfsbane potion. Snape knew, of course, that they wouldn't be able to brew it successfully, but he didn't care. He just needed his students to use their creativity to give Lupin a little Hogwarts shock. Snape went around in circles and was indeed shocked. Justin and Macmillan's cauldrons reeked of a bathroom, like someone's septic tank had exploded. "Are you sure you didn't secretly hide something to them?" Lisa Dupin and Padma Pettir's potions smelled alright, but they were as sticky as swamp mud. Snape learned after asking that Padma Pettir had made a small innovation, adding a little Gang's water from her homeland. Neville and Hannah, on the other hand, displayed astonishing creativity, brewing the wolfsbane potion into wolf poison, even corroding the outer wall of the cauldron with the potion. Snape sometimes wondered why his students couldn't learn things that were clearly written out and easy to understand at a glance. People are indeed different. Even the experienced Ralph got stuck at a certain step. He put the steamed bat tongues into the cauldron and stirred clockwise 3 times. According to the blackboard instructions, the potion should be light green, but it had turned purple. Ralph and Sherry checked the potion several times without finding a problem. Just as they were about to start over, Snape strolled in. He glanced at the cauldron, a mocking smile appearing on his face. Normally, even when Ralph didn't make a mistake, Snape would still be sarcastic. Now that there was a problem, wouldn't he be expected to give him a good taunt? But surprisingly, Snape didn't mock him. Instead, he lazily said, "The bat tongue has been cooked for too long. Try adding a little charcoal." Ralph raised an eyebrow, quickly grabbed a handful of charcoal, and threw it into the cauldron. The color slowly changed from red to green. Snape showed no sign of leaving, standing aside watching. Ralph and Sherry exchanged a helpless glance, and had no choice but to grit their teeth and continue brewing the potion. Sherry cleaned the snakebird's scales and threw them into the cauldron, while Ralph added a few drops of chameleon venom. The potion's color turned cobalt green. Snape added, "It's best to add a bottle of cinnamon tincture and simmer it over low heat for 3 minutes, it will make the potion solidify more easily." Wolfsbane potion didn't seem to have this step, and Ralph subconsciously glanced at the blackboard. Snape snorted impatiently, "I modified it myself, add it or not, take it or leave it." Since Snape had said so, Ralph had no choice but to comply. Sherry, who had been sitting next to Ralph, had to move her chair back when Snape approached. Soon, Sherry was far away from Ralph, squeezed to the side, and her original seat was taken by Snape. The girl with the ponytail looked at Ralph somewhat blankly, then at Snape sitting beside him giving instructions, feeling a little lost. It was her first. She was the one who sat there first, whether it was brewing the potion or helping Ralph process the materials. That was her seat, Professor Snape. The students all looked up, staring in shock at this scene of teacher-student harmony, Was this a dream? Actually, at this point, I think using werewolf blood instead of wolf blood would be best, Snape said, frowning. What do you think, Scamander? Ralph had no ideas whatsoever. He scratched his head and nodded in agreement. You think so too, Snape added softly, but werewolf blood is very difficult to obtain. Of course it was difficult. Werewolves were inherently dangerous, and killing them was extremely difficult. Of course, there were werewolves who sold their blood, like poor bastards like Lupin, but they could only sell a few hundred milliliters at most. Supply couldn't meet demand. By the way, Scamander, is the body of the werewolf Fenrir Greyback, whom you killed, still there? Snape asked casually. The truth was revealed, so this was what he was waiting for. Ralph immediately became alert. Fenrir Greyback's body has been taken by the Ministry of Magic, I know. Snape narrowed his eyes. But I heard from Dumbledore that you dissected most of his flesh and blood, didn't you? Ralph emphasized. Professor Snape, that wolf blood is mine, I didn't say it wasn't yours. Look at your arrogant attitude. Deduct 5 points from Hufflepuff. Professor Snape showed unprecedented patience, and his voice softened. He had tried everything last year, deducting points, poisoning, to get the basilisk, but nothing worked. Since force didn't work, Snape wanted to try a softer approach with Ralph, to appeal to his emotions. Scamander, we can trade, Professor Snape said in a low voice. I have plenty of magical materials, Ralph scoffed. Sorry, I don't need magical materials right now. He really didn't need magical materials. He could get some from Hagrid or trade with the centaurs. And what about potions? Snape's lips curled into a smile. I have many precious potions in my medicine vault. Ralph raised an eyebrow. He was indeed interested. He pondered for a moment and said, Professor Snape, we've been teacher and student, I won't cheat you. How about 7 or 8 liters of Felix Felicis first? I've never had that stuff before, thanks to Suspender Cat for the donation. Chapter 379 Sirius Black, controlled by Fury. Ralph's black box housed a reinforced company of magical creatures, and he also guarded the forbidden forest in his backyard, scavenging whenever he felt like it. He certainly didn't lack magical materials. What he lacked was an apothecary to brew potions for him. Sherry was exceptionally talented in transfiguration, but not in potions, and as Ralph's assistant, she was busy caring for the magical creatures every day. Neville was skilled in herbalism, good at tending magical plants, but brewing potions, he could burn a cauldron to pieces in a day. Hermione was quite good, very talented in potions, but this school year she had 10 classes a day, barely enough time to sleep. Even if Ralph was a beast, he couldn't continue to freeload and exploit her. But today's opportunity suddenly made Ralph realize that Professor Snape seemed like a good candidate. Lacking materials, wanting werewolves? Ralph had them. Those potions with long brewing times and high difficulty could all be brewed by Snape. For example, Felix Felicis. Of course, 7 or 8 liters of Felix Felicis is a joke, but 7 or 8 bottles is definitely achievable. In short, with Ralph and Snape arguing, it's now a matter of who backs down first. Snape teaching his students how to brew wolfsbane didn't cause much of a stir. In defense against the dark arts, Sirius was still teaching the Patronus charm. In charms, Professor Flitwick occasionally demonstrated some fighting skills. Even Professor Carity Babagi of Muggle Studies had recently been leading his students in investigating whether a drone that flew into Hogwarts was a Muggle spy. Who still follows the traditional curriculum these days? It just goes to show that Hogwarts teaching pace is indeed 30 years ahead of the industry. However, Snape's statement in class, that Professor Black is having an improper relationship with a werewolf still caused quite a stir. Professor Black was already over 30, a pureblood, from a wealthy family, and not as unattractive as Snape. There was no reason for him to still be single. Unexpectedly, he had someone on the side, a werewolf. Sirius Black's obsession with Fury undoubtedly piqued the students' curiosity. Everyone was fascinated by the werewolf. In Wednesday's defense against the dark arts class, Sirius began teaching a new spell. The Patronus charm was a profound spell, requiring extensive practice to master. It wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. Therefore, the course couldn't fall behind. Standing on the platform, he said in a deep voice, "A martial arts master once told me that offense is the best defense, and defense is the strongest defense." I wholeheartedly agree. The young wizards were all bewildered. What were they thinking? This contradictory dialectic. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you a defensive spell, the armor charm. The incantation is armor protection. Sirius paused, then continued, it's a spell that can withstand many types of attacks. It creates an invisible shield, deflecting both magical and physical attacks, thus protecting a specific person or area. The armor charm is effective against both wizards and muggle bullets, Sirius cautioned. Of course, it cannot withstand extremely powerful dark magic, such as the Avada Kedavra curse. The students followed Sirius in chanting the spell, but their voices were chaotic and weak. Sirius looked around curiously and asked, "What's wrong with you all today? You seem so distracted." Miss Abbott, Hannah hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "Professor Black, Professor Snape said something about you in potions class." Sirius frowned. "What did Snape say about me?" he said. Hannah glanced cautiously at Sirius's face and said, "You have a relationship with a werewolf that goes beyond friendship." Sirius couldn't help but laugh. After a moment, he suppressed his laughter and said, "Let me tell you a story. Would you like to hear it?" Everyone nodded eagerly. Once upon a time, there was a werewolf, the most ferocious werewolf in the world. He once killed 2 muggle children and was brought to the Ministry of Magic for questioning. But the werewolf was cunning. He disguised himself as a muggle vagrant, appearing astonished by the room full of wizards and terrified by the topic of the children's deaths. The werewolf convinced most of the officials present that he was a muggle, but one wizard noticed the werewolf's features in his appearance. So, he suggested to the committee that the werewolf be imprisoned until the full moon the following day. But the officials of the Ministry of Magic were arrogant. They thought it unnecessary and released the werewolf. The wizard thus offended the werewolf, and then, the wizard was killed. Justin interrupted. "No," Sirius shook his head. "The werewolf broke into the wizard's house and bit his son. The boy who was bitten was only 5 years old at the time, sleeping peacefully in bed, but on his birthday night, he turned into a werewolf." Many female students were so frightened that tears welled up in their eyes, and they covered their mouths with their hands to stop themselves from crying out loud. "Professor, what happened to the child afterward?" Macmillan asked. "Later, he came to Hogwarts and made 3 friends, very good friends." Sirius paused for a moment, then said softly, "That boy was a werewolf, and he would disappear once a month. He made up all sorts of reasons and stories to explain it because he was worried. His friends knew he was a werewolf, and they would be afraid of him and never speak to him again. I must say here, that kid was such a fool. How could his friends ignore him because of such a trivial matter?" Sirius's lips curled up when he said trivial matter, and he smiled. Anyway, his friends eventually found out the truth. They didn't ignore him. Instead, they secretly learned animagus powers and accompanied him in his transformation during the full moon, so he wouldn't suffer so much. After graduating, that werewolf could have joined the Dark Lords with other werewolves, where there was no discrimination and he could have lived a good life. But he didn't. Instead, he fought alongside his friends against the Death Eaters. "Professor, were you one of those 3 friends?" Hannah asked. "Yes, as that werewolf's friend, I want to say. I'm honored." Sirius looked at the students and smiled. "Professor Snape said that I had a relationship with that werewolf that went beyond friendship." "That's right, we're not just friends, we're brothers, half-brothers. Although he's a werewolf, he would never do anything to harm me. I love him more than a blood brother. Therefore, I implore everyone, to be more tolerant and less discriminatory towards werewolves who haven't harmed wizards or muggles." Sirius looked at Ralph in the crowd and said earnestly, "I also want to thank Ralph here. The werewolf who attacked my friend was named Fenrir Greyback. He had been at large for decades, and it was Ralph who killed him and avenged him. My friend also received help from Ralph when he was discriminated against and couldn't find a job." All the students turned to look at Ralph, their faces full of surprise. "Children, I must apologize to you. When I was still in school, I didn't really like Hufflepuff students. I always thought they were lazy and lacked passion," Sirius said with a look of shame. "But after meeting Ralph, I realized I was completely wrong. Hufflepuff students can be so outstanding, so brave, intelligent, and kind." Led by Sirius, the students clapped enthusiastically. Ralph almost couldn't hold back. Even someone as thick-skinned as him felt a little embarrassed by the praise. Shirley looked up at Ralph, a warm smile on her lips, her eyes gentle. She knew better than anyone else that Ralph was kind. He was not only kind, but also had a gentle heart. When the applause stopped, Neville asked, "Professor, what about your other 2 friends? Where did they go?" Sirius Black reached out his right hand and rubbed his face. only to find it was covered in tears. He was silent for a moment, then said sadly, "They're dead, thanks to the 4 generous donors, QQ Reading Friend 1,789,886,434,194, and for their generous donations." Chapter 380 Scamander's Family Background. In the library, sitting at a table in the corner, Shirley was meticulously describing to Hermione what had happened in defense against the dark arts class. After listening, Hermione raised her eyebrows, repeating with a half-smile, "Brave, intelligent, and kind. Professor Black praising Ralph like that?" Courageous and intelligent aside, he often deliberately bullied her with bets. Where was Ralph any semblance of kindness? He was clearly a wicked villain. As the saying goes, forced criticism equals whitewashing, and forced praise equals slander. So, while Sirius's words were all good, the excessive praise was a bit much for Ralph. However, he still shamelessly chuckled. "What, Hermione, do you have a different opinion? Everyone thinks so, the minority submits to the majority, your personal opinion is invalid, everyone thinks so." Hermione raised her voice, scoffing, "Besides Sirius, who else thinks so?" Ralph glanced at the girl with the ponytail. She didn't speak, only smiled gently and nodded slightly. "Shirley, you can't lie just because Ralph is your boss," Hermione said, putting her arm around the girl with the ponytail's shoulder. "We're on the same side." Shirley smiled and said seriously, "I really think so." Hermione sighed. Ralph smiled without saying a word. The 3 of them fooled around for a while longer. Mrs. Pants, the librarian, came twice with a feather duster, but finally left with a strange look on her face. Ralph cast a silence charm around them, so their voices couldn't be heard and wouldn't disturb anyone. Mrs. Pants could only see the 3 of them with their mouths open, as if they were performing a pantomime, but she couldn't hear their voices. On the table, there was a piece of parchment, a map, drawn with thin lines in ink. The lines converged and intersected, extending to every corner of the parchment. With Sirius's help, Ralph, Shirley, and Hermione had recently been making a new Marauders map. This new map included Hogwarts Castle, various secret passages, and Quidditch fields. Besides these, there were also the Room of Requirement and the Chamber of Secrets, which weren't on the original map. Ralph's original plan was to include the Black Lake, the Forbidden Forest, and Hogsmeade, but the project was far too large for 3 people to complete in a short time. "Let's begin." Ralph raised his wand, and Sherry and Hermione raised theirs simultaneously. The tips of the 3 wands met, and they said in unison, "Manifestation." The 3 wands attracted each other, sparking a burst of dazzling sparks, and then released a large cloud of water vapor that spread outwards. Soon, the entire library was shrouded in smoke, and many students looked up, curiously staring at the suddenly appearing fog. Not long after, the thick smoke gradually dissipated, and ink dots began to appear on the parchment map, which had previously only shown lines. Each ink dot was marked with a name in tiny letters. "We did it," Sherry said happily. The 3 of them cast the Human Tracks charm, an obscure spell and the core of the Marauders map. It displays the names of everyone within a smoke-covered area on the map. Hermione looked at the map in amazement, seeing many small black dots moving across the library. A black dot in the upper left corner showed Mrs. Pants, pacing hurriedly, seemingly searching for who had cast the spell. A group of Ravenclaw students were gathered at a table in the distance, studying. Of course. These names only showed the library area, other areas remained unmarked. The Human Tracks charm covered a very small area at a time. To display the entire castle, the 3 of them would have to move around bit by bit, a huge undertaking. But regardless, they had successfully mapped the library area, a good start. The 3 continued discussing the Human Tracks charm when they suddenly heard clattering footsteps approaching from afar. Ralph looked up and saw Hagrid, wearing a moleskin coat, striding towards them. Hagrid rarely came to the library, he was clearly looking for them. Ralph waved his wand, canceling the silence charm, and whispered, "What's wrong, Hagrid?" Hagrid handed him a letter, his voice tense. "Ralph, the matter concerning the hippogriff is settled. I think you might need to see it." Ralph took the letter and unfolded it. Sherry and Hermione also gathered around to look at the letter. "Dear Mr. Hagrid, we have received a report from Hogwarts regarding the hippogriff attack on students. On April 20th, we will hold a hearing at our London office to discuss the handling of you and the hippogriff. You and your hippogriff must attend on that day. During this time, the hippogriff should be tethered and kept in isolation. Ministry of Magic Educational Affairs, Head, Gershilda Marchban. Good news, Ralph smiled. The Education Bureau has taken over this matter. The hippogriff won't fall into the hands of the committee to handle dangerous creatures, but I don't know what to do. Hagrid scratched his head. What do I need to prepare? You need to collect students' feedback on your teaching, Ralph instructed. Prove you're a good teacher, capable of this position. This wasn't a problem. Hagrid had recently been strictly controlling his teaching content, only teaching beautiful and interesting magical creatures like unicorns. With Ralph's reminder, he even gave students animal tail feathers as rewards each class. There was absolutely no issue with student evaluations. You also need to prepare a defense, Hagrid, Ralph said smoothly. Write down the whole story, proving that Buckbeak had nothing to do with it and that it won't hurt anyone again. We can be witnesses, Sherry said softly. Yes, I'm sure I've read about a case involving a hippogriff that injured someone. Hermione thought for a moment and said, in that case, the hippogriff was released. We'll look for it for you later, Hagrid, and once we find it, we'll study it carefully. Thank you, all three of you. Hagrid was so moved he almost cried. He hurriedly went back to collect the evaluations. After Hagrid left, Hermione stretched and said, let's go find those cases and prepare a defense for Buckbeak. No need to look. Ralph shook his head and smiled. I have detailed records of nearly 2,000 years of cases involving magical creatures injuring people. Sherry took out a black box, and Ralph opened it, pulling out a parchment book half a person's height. Hermione was stunned for a moment, then began to flip through it in disbelief. In 1766, a monster with a human head, a dragon's body, and a lion's tail bit a wizard. It was sentenced to death by the Ministry of Magic. Carl Scamander defended him. Carl Scamander, my grandfather's uncle, my great-great-grandfather, Ralph explained. On June 5, 1872, a hippogriff was convicted. Joster Scamander defended it, my great-grandfather. Hermione flipped through the book, frowning. Why is most of it about Scamander? It's family tradition, Ralph shrugged. I'm not actually a magizoologist, nor a veterinarian, but a professional lawyer. Chapter 381 Disguised Magus. Due to the nature of their profession, Scamander wizards are generally well versed in law, possessing a deep understanding of the laws of various ministries of magic, especially those concerning magical creatures. Being a magizoologist is a high-risk profession. To avoid breaking the law, one must first understand it. Since they understand the law, defending magical creatures is commonplace for them, with enough cases to fill a book. Of course, not every defense is successful. Newt often lost cases in his youth. He once defended a horned beast, whose original punishment from the Ministry of Magic was merely the removal of its horn. Because of Newt's help, not only was the horn lost, but its two enormous testicles were also removed. Newt also defended a Niffler owner. The original sentence was 1,000 galleons in damages, but through Newt's persistent arguments, the fine was waived. However, the Niffler's owner was sentenced to imprisonment in Azkaban. It can only be said that in his youth, if Newt performed normally, his clients would be seeking his services for at least 5 years. For a long time, Dumbledore was even embarrassed to admit that Newt was his student. Newt's hands were stained with the blood of his clients, allowing him to continuously climb the ranks and become a high-level player. A high-level player, in this sense, makes their own laws or modifies those unfavorable to them. Newt established a werewolf register and collaborated with a Bureau of Dragon Research and Restriction, allowing him to travel the world with dragons without breaking the law. That's what a high-level player is. Newt certainly didn't want his grandson to follow in his footsteps, so it wasn't difficult for Ralph, under his long-term tutelage, to help Hagrid write a well-reasoned defense. The story of Professor Black and his werewolf friend quickly spread throughout Hogwarts. The sentimental students shed tears of sympathy, and in their emotion, they developed an unprecedented interest in the animagus mentioned by Professor Black. All the magic books about animagus in the library were borrowed, and the waiting list stretched until around Easter. Professor Sprout's greenhouse also suffered damage. The first step in learning to become an animagus is to keep a single mandrake leaf in your mouth for a full month. Many students would secretly pluck a few leaves during herbalism class. By the time Professor Sprout noticed, the immature mandrakes were reduced to bare vines. Rumors also circulated about a quick fix animagus potion. It was said that drinking this potion would allow one to easily learn to become an animagus in just 3 minutes, painless, scarless, and harmless. You'd think it was an abortion advertisement. In short, Many students bought the potion, eager to experience what it was like to become an animal. This potion was clearly a polysaccharide concoction containing animal hair. Many students who took it couldn't revert to their original form and had to be hospitalized at the school hospital. Malfoy was no exception. He became a half-man, half-weasel, with a furry face and a thick tail. Harry was thrilled and visited Malfoy at the hospital every day with Ron, even secretly taking pictures of him with Colin's camera. Soon, news of Harry forcing Malfoy to perform for him and even taking nude photos spread throughout Hogwarts. With so many students hospitalized, Professor McGonagall had to explain the dangers of animagus in class. Remember, animagus cannot freely transform into any animal. Their transformations are generally limited to non-magical creatures. Furthermore, there is no drug that can quickly create an animagus. That's all a lie. Standing on the podium, Professor McGonagall said sternly, and, even if you practice according to the animagus's steps, even at the very last step, you will still fail. Why is that, Professor McGonagall? Macmillan asked curiously, raising his hand. Because a solid foundation in transfiguration is a prerequisite for mastering animagus, Professor McGonagall explained. Only those skilled in transfiguration can learn animagus. You can't even turn a teapot into an animal. How can you possibly transform yourselves into animals? So, if you want to learn animagus, focus on our lessons first. Don't be overly ambitious. Justin raised his hand again and asked, Professor McGonagall, I've heard there's a type of wizard who is a natural animagus. Mr. Finley, you mean the disguise magus? Professor McGonagall corrected him. There are indeed wizards with exceptional transfiguration talent. They can change their appearance at will without taking Polyjuice potion, the young wizards whispered among themselves. If they could change their appearance at will, wouldn't they be able to become anyone? Professor, have you ever seen a disguise magus? Hannah asked curiously. I've seen it, I even taught it. Professor McGonagall paused, then smiled slightly. However, wizards like the disguise magus are one in a million. In all my years of teaching, I've only encountered 2 students like that. Ralph narrowed his eyes. He knew Tonks was a disguise magus, but neither of her parents were. Who else could it be besides her? Ralph glanced at Sherry beside him, who was flipping through her 6th-year transfiguration textbook. Come to think of it, the ponytail girl's transfiguration talent truly deserved the description of being one in a million. She was only a 3rd-year student, yet she had almost finished all her courses with Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall, look closely. Am I that one in a million disguise magus? Justin continued to ask. Mr. Finley, I wish you were a transfiguration genius more than anyone else. Professor McGonagall laughed. You know what? Every time I correct your papers, it's like I rewrite them myself. The students burst into laughter. At everyone's request, Professor McGonagall transformed into a tabby cat and demonstrated the animagus to the young wizards. The students applauded. Ralph stretched, and the tabby cat hurriedly jumped off the platform. With a soft poof, Professor McGonagall reverted to her original form and stared at Ralph. Ralph was completely bewildered. Professor McGonagall, your stress reaction is too much? Professor McGonagall was indeed terrified. After being held and petted so intensely by Ralph, she hadn't dared to transform into an animal in front of strangers for years. Professor McGonagall pursed her lips, her eyes flickering, and suddenly said, if you really want to experience what it's like to be an animal, I can make your wish come true. Professor McGonagall straightened her clothes and smiled. Come on, Mr. Scamander, let's start with you. Chapter 382 Kittens are born to be eaten by their mothers. Professor McGonagall waved her wand, sending the tables flying to the corner and clearing space. The students lined up, excitedly whispering among themselves. Becoming an animal was their dream, otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered studying animagus. Now that Professor McGonagall was willing to help, and safety was guaranteed, who wouldn't want to become an animal, ride a beast, and practice right there? Ralph really didn't want to, at least not under Professor McGonagall's wing. He always felt that beneath this older cat girl's warm smile lay ill intentions. Had he offended her? Well, back in their first year, Ralph had indeed made a minor offense to Professor McGonagall in her tabby cat form. But she gave him Christmas presents every year. Flying broomsticks, cat trees, cat litter, each one carefully selected. Well, perhaps a bit of a waste? In any case, McGonagall might be holding a grudge and wanting to retaliate. Gryffindors are known for holding grudges, just look at Hermione. He tricked her out of 5 galleons on their first meeting, and she held a grudge for years. Ralph walked forward with a death wish, while Professor McGonagall smiled. She had finally found her chance to settle a personal score in class. Professor McGonagall waved her wand at the boy, and he quickly transformed into an orange cat with sapphire eyes that blinked. Ralph extended a paw and lightly scratched the ground, leaving only a few marks. He flicked his tail and took 2 steps forward, with a powerful, almost swaggering, gait. Of course, this was Ralph's own perception. From the student's perspective, his cat-like walk was exceptionally graceful, especially the way his little bottom wiggled, truly captivating. This adorable kitten elicited screams and frenzy from many witches in the classroom. They all wanted to rush forward, pick Ralph up, and give him a good rub. Kittens are born to be eaten by their mothers. Ralph had used the Shapeshifter spell before and learned the Native American shaman skinwalker technique, both of which allowed him to temporarily transform into animals. Therefore, becoming a cat caused him no discomfort. He circled around a few times, then squatted down, looking at Professor McGonagall and gesturing for her to change him back. Professor McGonagall waved her wand again, but instead of changing him back, she used the summoning charm. "Litterbox, come here." Soon, a large wooden litterbox flew in, filled with cat litter and emitting a strong catnip scent. Professor McGonagall, with a mischievous grin, walked towards Ralph. A slight smile played on her lips, but she deliberately kept a straight face, saying, "Mr. Scamander, I received your Christmas present, but I still don't know what it's for. Why don't you demonstrate it for me?" Ralph's tail twitched, terrified. If Professor McGonagall grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and threw him into the letterbox, he'd be truly mortified. He'd be a recluse from now on. Sure enough, even as an older cat Giro, Professor McGonagall was still essentially an evil Gryffindor. When it came to revenge, this lioness was ruthless. Ralph, of course, wasn't going to sit idly by. He suddenly rushed out, first to the left, then to the right, trying to escape towards the door. Professor McGonagall waved her wand, and Ralph suddenly tilted his body, dodging a long, thin rope that darted towards him. His hind paws slightly bent, he lightly touched the ground. His cat body somersaulting several times in the air, dodging a full-body binding charm. Ralph was agile, skillfully dodging all of Professor McGonagall's spells, moving with the grace of a dragon in flight, as beautiful as a startled swan, winning continuous cheers from the students. Professor McGonagall also continued to wave her wand, creating numerous magical barriers in the classroom, shrinking Ralph's range of movement. HMPH, trying to escape. Just when it seemed Ralph wouldn't be able to keep up and was about to be caught by Professor McGonagall, a girl with a wine-red ponytail suddenly stepped out from the crowd. Professor McGonagall stopped what she was doing, and Ralph breathed a sigh of relief, thinking to himself, "I'm saved." He quickly ran towards Sherry and hid at her feet. His little assistant was so considerate. Neville, Hannah, and Susan, seeing him suffer, just watched from afar. Why didn't they dare fight Professor McGonagall? Just as Ralph was lost in thought, a pair of hands suddenly reached out and gently grabbed him. Amidst the students' surprised and astonished gazes, Sherry quickly bent down and scooped Ralph up, holding him in her arms. The girl with the ponytail looked at Professor McGonagall and smiled softly. Although she didn't speak, her eyes and smile seemed to be pleading for Ralph's life. Professor McGonagall gazed at Sherry's face with a smile, but when her gaze swept over Ralph, her expression hardened, and she glared at him. If it weren't for Sherry's pleading, she would have shoved him into the litter box today. Professor McGonagall showed no intention of turning Ralph back. She simply waved her hand and said, "All right, next student." Ralph cried out, "Please turn me back quickly," but all he made was a cute meow meow meow. "Don't move, Ralph," Sherry whispered as she carried the cat to the back of the line. "Be careful Professor McGonagall doesn't put you in the litter box again." Ralph obediently lay in her arms, inhaling the girl's sweet fragrance. The students lined up again to receive Professor McGonagall's transformation, but their attention remained fixed on Sherry and Ralph. The girl with the ponytail, holding the orange cat, stood by the window, sunlight streaming down their faces, creating a breathtaking scene. The male students wished they could be Ralph, while the female students stared at Sherry with envy, wanting to take her place and hug the orange cat that Ralph had become. Ralph was quite comfortable lying in her warm, soft embrace, but suddenly his eyes widened as he looked up at Sherry. The girl reached out and grasped the cat's tail, gently curling it with her fingers. Shirley smiled, making a playful face, and said, Who told you to pull my ponytail every day? Now we're even." Many boys were mesmerized. Shirley, growing more and more beautiful each day, usually so quiet and reserved, was showing this lively and bright side of herself for the first time. She was so beautiful. Unfortunately, the smile wasn't for them. Then, something even more enviable happened. The girl with the ponytail picked up the cat and, with lightning speed, lightly kissed him between the eyes. Rolf, completely stunned, murmured, "Meow, thanks to the 3 generous donors, I love a little Shiba Inu. A little life is good for Remy." Sun and moon shine together, and just love waiting in the water for their generous donations. Chapter 383 Peter, who gave birth to Tom. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the treetops, and the hazy twilight enveloped the dilapidated Riddle house. A shadow suddenly appeared, cloaked and hooded. He glanced around furtively, making sure no one was following him, before cautiously making his way towards the rundown old house. Peter Pettigrew quietly entered the house, climbing the dusty stairs to an unmarked door. He pushed it open and entered a dimly lit room. The ceiling was low, and in a niche carved into the thick earthen wall, a candle flickered. Peter closed the door. A breeze stirred, causing the candle flame to sway and cast flickering shadows around him, making the room seem even darker and colder. A slender cobra slithered out from a crack in the wall, its patterned back revealing a pair of red eyes blinking. A cold voice rang out from within the snake's body, "Wormtail, have you gotten everything?" "Yes, master." "The unicorn blood and rune venom you requested." Peter, using his only remaining left hand, pulled 2 vials from his pocket. He complained, "It took me a lot of effort. This stuff is hard to find in Nocturne Alley. I only have one hand, and I also have to be wary of horrors. Wormtail, the Dark Lord has seen your hard work." Voldemort, possessing the cobra, said softly, "Once I get a physical body, I'll give you a satisfactory arm. Let's get started." Peter was overjoyed. He then asked, "Master, should I find you a muggle?" "There are some in the village." "A muggle," Voldemort said coldly. "Wormtail, do you want me to crawl out of a mudblood's belly? Those vile creatures will defile my body." "Then who should we look for?" Peter said in a trembling voice. "Master, I only have one arm now. It's probably very difficult to capture a pure-blood wizard for you. Aren't you the best candidate?" Voldemort said in a hoarse voice. "You will use this spell." "What, me, master?" Peter's voice became panicked. "Yes, Wormtail, aren't you happy? This is an honor bestowed upon you by the Dark Lord," Voldemort said with displeasure. "If Bellatrix were here, she would offer me her womb without hesitation, even if it already contained a child." You, Peter's voice grew increasingly terrified, his mouth seemed to have become very dry. You want to kill me, Wormtail?" "Why would I kill you?" Voldemort whispered. "You are my only servant now, I cherish you more than anything, but, don't worry, that magic won't kill you," Voldemort comforted him. "You will still be useful on my final path to resurrection." Peter finally breathed a sigh of relief. He wiped the sweat from his brow, opened 2 bottles, and mixed the unicorn blood and rune serpent venom together. After taking this potion, combined with the spell, it would allow Voldemort to escape his ghostly state and gain a weak physical body. He could wait in that body for the ingredients needed for true regeneration. "Wormtail, open your mouth," Voldemort commanded. "I'm going in." Voldemort detached himself from the cobra, transforming into a shadow and slipping into Peter's gaping mouth. Peter picked up the cup and drank the potion. The icy potion went down his throat and into his stomach. He quickly felt nauseous, dizzy, and his abdomen cramped violently. His stomach began to churn. Peter squatted down and vomited, filling the room with a foul stench. He struggled to breathe, feeling as if he were about to vomit up his heart, liver, and lungs. Finally stopping, Peter, drenched in sweat, removed his robes. Naked, he slowly knelt and chanted a spell aloud. As the spell ended, Peter began to tremble all over. His body seemed to inflate slowly, his abdomen soon swelling as if about to burst. Peter slumped onto the cold floor, gasping for breath, copious amounts of blood gushing out, black as ink, a truly gruesome sight. Wormtail cried out in terror and pain. A moment later, a small, withered black shadow struggled to appear. The shadow's hands twisted and clenched, its red fingers gripping the ground, and it slowly crawled outwards until its entire body was inside the world. Peter sat on the ground, weakly raising his head to look at the Dark Lord whose body had been magically reshaped. Only the size of a small dog, hairless, its body seemingly covered in scales, its skin a dark, reddish color, like wounded flesh. It also had a flat, snake-like face with a pair of gleaming red eyes. Tom Riddle was no longer the ghostly shadow. "Wormtail, pick me up," Voldemort commanded. Peter, his body aching from the magic tearing him apart, wanted to lie down for a while, but he endured the pain, got up, took his robe, and wrapped a small Voldemort in it. "Give me your wand," Voldemort whispered. Peter quickly handed over the wand, which the Dark Lord's small arm seemed to struggle to hold. But he still managed to lift it, waving it in the air. The wand drew a streak of light like molten silver, initially shapeless, then twisting and transforming into a shimmering human hand, as bright as moonlight. It flew down and landed on Peter's right hand, which Ralph had severed. Peter looked up, staring incredulously at the silver hand. He tried to move the gleaming fingers, which seemed stronger than his own. Peter knelt and said gratefully, "My master, master, it's so beautiful, thank you, thank you. I told you, the Dark Lord won't let those who help him go unpunished." After using this spell, the infant-sized Voldemort grew even weaker, looking utterly exhausted. "Get up. I still have many things for you to do. Stealing the Philosopher's Stone is hopeless. I can only restore my original body through another method. You also need to help me fully resurrect and obtain those 3 potent ingredients, Harry Potter." Peter shuddered. "Yes, I only want him," Voldemort said coldly. "Don't worry, we have that thing. It'll be easy to figure out Harry Potter's movements. As for my father's bones, they're in the cemetery behind the church in Little Hangleton." Voldemort's snake-like face twisted, revealing a cruel smile. He hissed softly, as if talking to himself. "Father, I killed you back then. I never imagined that decades later, you would still be of use, my Muggle father." Just then, the church bells rang, and the long brewing rain finally began to fall, relentlessly pounding against the window panes. Chapter 384 Adult Quidditch. With the arrival of February, the first Quidditch match of the new school year began, Hufflepuff vs Ravenclaw. Ravenclaw's record was currently poor, with 2 losses and ranking last. Another loss in this match would truly make them easy prey. Therefore, Ravenclaw needed to do everything in their power to defeat Hufflepuff. Ralph didn't play Seeker this time. His hippogriff-like dynamic vision was like a telescope, allowing him to lock onto the golden snitch in just a few seconds. It was simply too much. More than winning, Ralph wanted to enjoy the fun of Quidditch, and the chaser position offered the thrill of close-quarters combat. Ravenclaw's 3 chasers were all witches, constantly double-teaming and pressuring Ralph, who was controlling the ball, making his life miserable. Ralph's signature iron elbow was also ineffective in this match. His opponents deliberately used their soft, elastic chests as cushions, significantly reducing the destructive power of his relentless elbows. Sure enough, there's no invincible trick, but there's always a way to counter it. This style of play made Ralph uncomfortable, but he wasn't in a hurry. He wanted to enjoy the game and have some fun with him. The main focus was on an adult, cough cough, fun Quidditch. Captain Cedric also seemed lost in this match. As the Seeker, instead of trying to catch the golden snitch, he was glued to Cho Chang the entire time. Wherever she flew, he flew. Were you some kind of fighter jet escort? Ravenclaw is known for its beautiful women, and Cho Chang's exotic looks undoubtedly attracted many male students. Therefore, Cedric's escorting behavior drew a lot of boos, especially from Harry in the Gryffindor stands, who practically wanted to take off Ron's smelly shoe and throw it at Cedric. He had played a few matches with Cho and had noticed this pretty girl long ago. He had always wanted to approach her but was afraid of scaring her away. He never expected Cedric to make his move first during the match, and so closely at that. The girl he liked was being affectionate and physically involved with someone else. Harry's eyes blazed with anger. George, standing beside him, chimed in, "I heard Cedric's been inviting Cho Chang to practice Quidditch privately lately." "Yeah," Fred clicked his tongue, "the moves in private practice are much more elaborate than this." Harry crushed the chocolate frog in his hand. "Harry, what's wrong?" Ron asked with concern. "Nothing." Harry paused for a moment, feeling a pang of sadness. "I also want to practice with Cho Chang privately. It'll definitely improve my skills." "What's so good about training with her?" Ron put his arm around Harry's shoulder, volunteering. "Harry, I'll practice with you. My volley technique is very good, you'll see once you get to know me a few times." Cho finally caught a golden snitch, but Ravenclaw still lost the game by a narrow margin. Hufflepuff's biggest contributor was Ralph. He was sleepwalking in the first half, getting badly worn down by Ravenclaw's 3-hawk strategy. But he woke up in the second half, relying on his firebolt and ball handling skills, surrounded by 3 witches, controlling the ball, breaking through, and shooting in a single, unstoppable run. He was absolutely dominant. The Ravenclaw students were devastated. If they kept losing, they would become numb and indifferent. But last year, after the new Seeker, Cho Chang, joined the team, Ravenclaw won against Slytherin and Gryffindor, leading the Hawks to believe that their team was about to bounce back after their astonishing 2-16 record. Unexpectedly, before they could even take off, they crashed again this year. It can only be said that despair is not terrible. What's terrible is having had hope in the first place. But the Ravenclaw team had their reasons. Gryffindor's entire team had Nimbus 2010, Slytherins were Nimbus 2001, and even Hufflepuff had a Firebolt. What kind of flying broomsticks did Ravenclaw have? How could they expect them to win? Professor Flitwick was helpless. He certainly didn't have the money to buy firebolts. He was now praying to Merlin to send a powerful figure to Ravenclaw, leading the team to a great revival. It just goes to show, anything is possible in dreams. As February ended, the snow at Hogwarts began to melt, but the weather grew increasingly cold. A flu epidemic further devastated Hogwarts, causing many students to fall ill. Some students already needed Polyjuice potion treatment, and now there was an even greater shortage of staff, leaving Madame Pomfrey scrambling. The most excited about this flu was Professor Trelawney. In the first class last year, she predicted the arrival of a flu, and it actually happened. In prophecy class, Professor Trelawney seemed somewhat smug. Her voice was hoarse as she said, "Last Christmas, I warned Madame Pomfrey to be careful of the flu, but she wouldn't listen. Humph, like Minerva. She lacks reverence for divination, and she doesn't respect me either." Professor Trelawney's tone made it seem as if the flu outbreak at Hogwarts was entirely Madame Pomfrey and Professor McGonagall's fault. "Professor Trelawney, what's wrong with your voice?" Hannah raised her hand. "I'm losing my voice." Professor Trelawney's voice grew even hoarser. "Of course, only temporarily. I told you about it last September. Did you get the flu too?" Susan asked with concern. "Silly child, I encountered this flu long ago. How could I possibly get sick?" Professor Trelawney sat down in an empty armchair, her hand, adorned with bracelets and rings, gently stroking her thin, sheer shawl. She sighed. "I revealed the flu to you, and I was punished and warned. A student should have died from this flu, but because of my reminder, he survived and had a huge impact on the future." Trelawney raised her head, staring intently at Rove. Seeing everyone looking at him, Rove moved his chair to the side. Unfortunately, Professor Trelawney's gaze followed Rove, as if he were the student who should have died from the flu. "But I don't regret it. To exchange a brief loss of voice for a life, who else but me?" Trelawney closed her eyes tightly. Hannah and Susan, true to their role as good straight men, immediately clapped and shouted, "Professor Trelawney, you are a great wizard." Many students clapped, looking at Trelawney with fervor and awe, like believers. "Professor Trelawney really lost her voice?" Neville asked softly. "How could that be?" Rove lowered his voice and asked, "Where's your rave?" Neville retrieved the sleeping Raffer from his head and handed him to Ralph. Ralph took it, waved his wand, and Raffer flew over, landing on Professor Trelawney's lap. Trelawney sensed something, opened her eyes, and saw an ugly toad crawling on her lap, covered in dense bumps, looking quite creepy. Raffer stuck out his tongue and licked Trelawney's hand, and she shrieked, "Ah, a toad!" Everyone stared at Professor Trelawney, whose voice was now booming and shrill, creating an awkward moment, thanks to Jiang Dongrat and a body of mutual attack maniac for their generous donations. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 385 Rolf, Professor, shall we make a bet? As a seasoned con artist, Trelawney had experienced countless embarrassing moments in her fortune-telling career. For example, when she applied for a position as a divination professor at Hogwarts, she arranged to meet Dumbledore at the Hog's Head. The headmaster asked her to read his palm. To make a good impression on Dumbledore, Trelawney said he had a very long lifeline and would live to be 100. Dumbledore, however, smiled and told her he was exactly 99 years old. Even in such an awkward situation, Trelawney managed to smooth things over. Today, with a small mishap, she quickly came up with a plan. Her face was grave as she said, "My voice is healed? Oh no, this is terrible." Everyone looked at Trelawney in dismay. She sighed dramatically, as if putting on a show. "This only proves one thing. The student who was supposed to die from the flu but was saved by me will still die. So the punishment for leaking the prophecy has vanished. It seems fate is unavoidable." Professor Trelawney then looked at Ralph with pity, and the students all stared at him in horror. Ralph smirked. What a thick-skinned fellow. Ever since Ralph cured his ADHD, Raffer had become somewhat withdrawn, especially around the female toads, even feeling inferior. Seeing so many people watching, his withdrawal and inferiority complex flared up simultaneously, and he quickly hopped back into Neville's arms. Professor Trelawney stared at Neville again and said, "Child, is this your pet?" "Yes, Professor Trelawney, it just ran away by accident," Neville stammered. "I'm sorry. Well, then you'd better be careful." Professor Trelawney's voice was ethereal, the firelight flickering on her long emerald earrings. "It will bring you a calamity when you turn 14, one you can't escape." "All right." Professor Trelawney stood up, straightened her shawl, and continued in a low voice, "Last year we finished learning about the shape of tea leaves, and not long ago we learned about palmistry. According to the schedule, today we should learn about the omens of flames." Trelawney pointed to a corner where a pile of braziers sat on a shelf. She said softly, "You each need to pick up a brazier, then come here to get some sage, light it in the brazier, and finally sit down and carefully observe the flames. You can use pages 78 and 96 of the book Seeing the Future Through the Fog to interpret the shape of the flames." Everyone was excited. Although playing with fire was risky, it was still more exciting than drinking tea leaves or reading palms. After receiving the teaching materials, Rove put the sage in the brazier, snapped his fingers, and a tiny flame immediately leaped out, like a swift mouse. Seeing that everyone had light their sage, Professor Trelawney's voice drifted on. "Flame is alive, it changes and leaps, never still, like a book that keeps turning. To see it clearly, one first needs years of arduous training to witness the shadows within the flame, and then many more years to distinguish which shadows belong to the future, which to the present, and which to the past. In any case, the process is extremely difficult. Even I took a long time to grasp its secrets." Professor Trelawney walked towards the students, the jewels on her body clinking and tinkling. "Therefore, I will walk among you, to help you, to guide you, to peer into this unfathomable flame." Justin and Macmillan began to chuckle uncontrollably, having to put their fists in their mouths to stifle their laughter. Professor Trelawney overheard them, leaning closer to ask, "What did you see that made you so happy?" Justin quickly flipped open his book and read from the textbook, "An acorn, a windfall, unexpected gold." "I'll have lots of gold someday. If I were you, I wouldn't be so sure, dear," Professor Trelawney said, shaking her head as she looked at the flames. "A split peach, your buttocks are in danger, watch out for your roommate." Justin glanced fearfully at Macmillan and moved his chair further away from him. Everyone else looked at Macmillan. After all, the two of them were always walking arm in arm together. Macmillan blushed and retorted loudly, "But Professor, from my perspective, it looks more like a fire dragon, not a peach bud at all. Is that so?" Professor Trelawney's gleaming eyes shifted to Macmillan, and she asked again, "Then what shape is your flame?" Macmillan scratched his head and said, "A rose. Does that mean I'm going to have sweet love?" "I don't think so." Professor Trelawney shook her head and said in a muffled voice, "I think I saw your final divination grade. It seems you're going to fail, dear. You'll have to work harder." Such a blatant threat immediately made Macmillan back down, no longer daring to argue with Trelawney. After all, whether he passed or failed was ultimately up to her. With Macmillan setting an example, no one dared to argue with Professor Trelawney anymore, and everyone obediently observed the flame. Ralph sat in his chair, took out a bottle of potion from his pocket, and poured it into the brazier. The flames immediately leaped high, blackening the ceiling. This act of playing with fire undoubtedly caught Professor Trelawney's attention, and she immediately came over, the bracelet making a soft, tinkling sound. "Child, what are you doing?" "Professor Trelawney, I'm observing the flames." Ralph quietly put away the medicine bottle and smiled. "I just suddenly discovered that I might have a 1-in-a-million talent for divination. I seem to have awakened what you often call the third eye." "I'm sorry, child." Professor Trelawney shook her head and sighed. "To be honest, and don't be upset, my dear, I've noticed it for a long time. The halo surrounding you is very small, about the size of a grain of rice. You're like that little girl from Gryffindor named Hermione Granger." with a very poor ability to receive future resonance. In other words, you have absolutely no talent for prophecy. Ralph twitched the corners of his mouth, a pure smile appearing on his face, and said, "How about we make a bet?" "A bet?" Professor Trelawney frowned. "What are we betting on?" "We'll bet on the shape of my flames." Ralph smiled. "If you win, I'll be your loyal follower from now on. If you tell me to go east, I'll never go west. If you tell me to chase a dog, I'll never catch a chicken. If I win, I hope I get full marks in all my future divination classes." Professor Trelawney narrowed her eyes, watching Ralph. Neville, seeing Trelawney's apparent interest, wanted to warn her not to gamble. The last person Ralph bet with was Hermione. If she gambled a few more times, she'd lose everything. "You can gamble," Professor Trelawney said softly. "I see a grave, a cracked grave, and out crawls a monster." Ralph shook his head. "I see a fire serpent." "Child, you're mistaken. The flames clearly indicate a grave. There's truth in the flames, but it's not always so easy to grasp." Before Professor Trelawney could finish speaking, she suddenly froze. The flames flickered, quickly coalescing into the shape of a small snake, slender and grayish-white, its eyes flashing red. It slid in the brazier, leaving a trail of ash behind it. It was a fire serpent. Ralph smiled, narrowing his eyes. "I win, Professor Trelawney." Chapter 386 Harry, who likes to poach other people's partners. The news of Ralph's bet with Trelawney and his victory spread like wildfire throughout Hogwarts after class. While many considered Trelawney a fraud, she had many more loyal followers, such as Hannah and Susan. Now that Ralph had won against Trelawney in the realm of fire prediction, he naturally received wild praise from these admirers. In their embellished descriptions, Ralph leaped to become a prophet with an awakened third eye, rivaling Trelawney's ancestor, the famous prophet Cassandra Trelawney. The most direct consequence of this was that a group of students flocked to him, not to have him treat their pets, but to have him tell their fortunes. Star readings, marriage predictions, future predictions. Did they really think he was a charlatan? Most outrageously, a group of female students used palm reading as a pretext to grope him. A witch weighing around 200 pounds, with a waist as thick as a locust tree, even asked Ralph to feel her bones and tell her destiny. Those breasts and buttocks, no matter how skilled Ralph was, he probably couldn't touch the bones. Surrounded by the witches, he was forced to hide in the library, only managing to escape their entanglement thanks to Mrs. Pants wielding a feather duster. Ralph quickly found Sherry in a corner, doing her defense against the dark arts homework, and sat down next to her. The girl with the ponytail had obviously heard about what happened in divination class. She stopped writing with her quill and looked up curiously, asking, "Ralph, everyone's saying you awakened your third eye and won the bet against Professor Trelawney." Ralph explained the whole thing, then took a small bottle from his pocket and gently waved it in front of her, saying, "Actually, winning the bet against Professor Trelawney was all thanks to this." Sherry took the bottle, opened the cap, sniffed it lightly, and asked, "What's this?" "A potion made from the ashes left by a dead fire serpent," Ralph explained. Ash serpents are very special magical creatures. They are born when magical fire burns uncontrollably for too long. However, ash serpents have a very short lifespan, only 1 hour. After laying their eggs in a secluded place, their bodies disintegrate and turn to dust. Newt, while researching ash serpents, discovered that boiling this dust into a potion and sprinkling it into flames could accelerate the spawning of ash serpents. This is why Ralph dared to make a bet with Professor Trelawney. After all, he's a professional. "So you haven't awakened your third eye?" Sherry rested her pointed chin on the back of her hand, somewhat regretfully. "I was hoping you could do my divination." "I can do yours now," Ralph chuckled. "Although I haven't awakened my third eye, I'm quite good at divination. I'm very accurate at predicting marriage, fortune, and destiny." Hermione told me that Professor Trelawney's teachings are all fake. "She's a fraud." Sherry smiled, tilting her head. "What could you possibly learn from her?" "That's because Hermione isn't skilled enough." Ralph shook his head. "Professor Trelawney said her aura is very weak, and she has a poor capacity to resonate with the future. Hermione and I are not divination geniuses." Sherry covered her mouth and chuckled softly. "Try saying that to Hermione's face." Ralph twitched his lips. Of course, he couldn't say that to Hermione's face, or that little girl would definitely fight him to the death. "Surely, whether I can do it or not, you'll have to try to find out," Ralph urged. "Hurry up, let me read your palm." The girl with the ponytail blinked, then held out her hand, palm up, back of hand down, on the table. Closer, Ralph chuckled. I can't see it clearly from so far away. Shirley blinked her beautiful eyes slightly, raised her hand, and offered it to Ralph, who then grasped it. Ralph gently held the girl's hand and looked down to examine it closely. It was a pair of extremely delicate and beautiful hands, only half the size of his palm, with skin as smooth as warm jade. Ralph extended his fingers and gently stroked the girl's palm. Shirley blushed, almost to the point of being radiant. She lowered her voice and asked, Ralph, what are you doing? Ralph answered matter-of-factly, reading palms. Is this how you read palms? The girl with the ponytail bit her lip, feeling her entire arm burning, especially when his fingers caressed her palm. Her hand trembled sensitively. Ralph observed the lines on Shirley's palm, saying, this is the lifeline, starting between the Jupiter mound and the first Mars mound, that is, the middle part of the line between the base of the index finger and the base of the thumb. The lifeline extends towards the center of the palm, forming a crescent shape. It is quite long, and the end of the line gradually tapers, indicating that you will have a long lifespan. Shirley listened intently to the explanation, then asked softly, Ralph, can I see your palm? Of course, Ralph said, extending his right hand and smiling, but my lifeline is very short, short indeed. Ralph had transmigrated. The original Scamander had died young, only 7 or 8 years old. Shirley gazed at the boy's palm lines, looked down for a moment, then suddenly reached out a slender, delicate finger, as tender as a green onion, and traced the lifeline outwards. The girl with the ponytail said earnestly, Ralph, my lifeline is very long, I'll share half with you. Ralph held her fingers, smiled gently, and said, Shirley, my luck is very good. I'll share half with you too. The girl looked up, flashing a bright smile, and Ralph patted Shirley's ponytail. Just then, Harry and Ron walked over from a distance. As Harry approached, he said nervously, Ralph, I just heard you opened your third eye. I have something I want to ask you. Ralph tilted his head, his face darkening, and asked, what is it? Are you here to have your love fortune told too? You can tell fortunes about that, Harry asked, somewhat surprised. Then you can tell my fortune too. Okay. Harry really wanted to know if there was still a chance between him and Cho Chang. Ron glanced at Harry, pondered for a moment, and said, Harry, your love life will be quite bumpy. Let me put it this way, all the girls you like in the future will have boyfriends. And their boyfriends will all be your friends. Don't worry, Ron continued, even though they all have boyfriends, they'll eventually end up with you. Ron wasn't making this up. In the original timeline, when Harry liked Jo and Ginny, they both had boyfriends. Ginny's boyfriend was even Harry's roommate, Dean Thomas, a classic case of stealing a friend's girlfriend. Ron thought back to Ron's words and was immediately stunned. Harry liked his friend's girlfriend, and in the end, that girl ended up with Harry? Doesn't that mean Harry is the kind of person who thinks, my sister-in-law is so beautiful. We'll be best buddies forever. The more Ron thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. He'd have to be more careful with Harry in the future, otherwise, he'd just go out for a stroll, come home to find his heart sinking, and guess what? You're playing adult Quidditch with my girlfriend. Harry regretted coming to Ralph, but still forced a smile and said, Ralph, I actually wanted you to interpret my dream. My scar was hurting a few days ago, and I dreamt about Voldemort. Ralph's expression immediately turned serious. What did you see? Harry hesitated for a moment, then whispered, I dreamt that Voldemort crawled out of Peter Pettigrew's butt, and Peter gave birth to Tom. Chapter 387 Ralph, I'm a professional at inducing lactation. As a half-finished Horcrux, a fragment of Voldemort's soul resides in the scar on Harry's forehead. Whenever Voldemort is emotionally agitated, that fragment of soul is awakened, wanting to return to the main soul. Thus, Harry's scar aches, and his consciousness is forced to penetrate Voldemort's body through the soul, spying on his actions, an effect comparable to a pinhole camera. Often, Harry's dreams can be considered important intelligence for predicting Voldemort's movements. However, the idea of Peter giving birth to Tom sounds too far-fetched, leading Ralph to wonder if Harry was simply having a bizarre dream? Or perhaps, Peter is emulating the story of the Peacock King Bodhisattva swallowing the Buddha, wanting to become Tom Riddle's father? But the Peacock King Bodhisattva is at least female, and you're a man. Well, what right does Ralph have to assume Peter Pettigrew's gender? In short, the Dark Lord's actions are so perverse, he can't simply be looking for a father. He must have other motives. Whatever his purpose, what he ultimately wanted was resurrection. Without the Philosopher's Stone, Harry's blood was an essential ingredient for Voldemort's resurrection. He would inevitably return to Hogwarts. Ralph decided to speed things up and finish the new Marauders map as soon as possible. Throughout March, Ralph, along with Sherry and Hermione, ran around the castle, measuring every corner of the school on foot. They even went to the Chamber of Secrets, which had been mostly destroyed by the fiend fire curse. Hogwarts was like a mysterious witch, completely shrouded in secrecy, but Ralph was gradually stripping away her layers, leaving nothing hidden. By the Black Lake, there grew a crooked old willow tree, leaning precariously towards the lake, like an unfinished arched bridge. As the weather warmed, the willow sprouted new buds, and its branches swayed gently in the wind, a lovely sight. After completing the map of the area around the Black Lake, the three of them rested on the trunk of that crooked tree. Hermione stretched out her legs together, and yawned comfortably. Once this is done, the map is finished. I've been so tired lately, climbing up and down all day, my back hurts. Let me give you a massage, Sherry said with a smile, placing her hand on Hermione's waist and gently kneading it. Yes, right there, a little harder. Ah, Hermione winced and gasped. That feels so good, Sherry. Who taught you this massage technique? From Ralph, Sherry replied with a smile. You learned it from Ralph. Hermione raised an eyebrow, her face full of curiosity. Ralph, who did you learn it from? Self-taught. Ralph stretched out his hand, making a claw-like gesture, and explained, I learned this technique when I was helping a ream cow produce milk. Hermione looked at Ralph's gesture, her face flushing red. She spat, you pervert, Hermione, how can you call that perverted? Ralph rolled his eyes. A bunch of hungry calves are waiting to drink milk. This is a technical skill, Ralph has now mastered it. Even if he doesn't pursue a career in magical creatures, he can become a professional lactation consultant. Hermione suddenly remembered seeing Sherry drinking a reddish-brown milk that morning. Sherry said it was ream cow milk. She even took a few sips and praised the taste. It can't be. Shirley seemed to know what Hermione was thinking. She rested her chin on her hand, nodded, and smiled. Yes. The milk you drank this morning was from Ralph's milk. Hermione really wanted to grab a rope and hang herself from the old, crooked tree beneath her. What's there to be embarrassed about? Ralph chuckled. Hermione, the milk you buy at the supermarket is also milked. Otherwise, how could it grow out of the shelf by itself? Besides, ream cow milk is highly nutritious and very beneficial for physical development. It's something most wizards can't even get their hands on. Ralph wasn't lying. Ream cows are magical creatures that live in North America. Because their blood can temporarily increase the strength of the drinker, they have been hunted extensively, and their numbers are now very small. Ralph leaned against the tree trunk and asked, by the way, have you two decided on the passwords to open and close the map? Setting a password on the map can prevent it from being picked up and misused if it is lost. The Marauders map, created by the Pillagers, had the following passwords for opening and closing. I solemnly swear I will not do anything good and prank over. But Ralph wasn't going to play pranks, so a new password was needed. The three had previously discussed open sesame and closed sesame, but felt they were too old-fashioned. Sherry pondered for a moment, then smiled and said, how about using the opening charm and locking charm? That's a good idea. Hermione nodded. Most people probably wouldn't think of Alohomora and close the doors, these two spells. Seeing that they both agreed, Ralph picked up his wand and wrote the spell on the map. The writing quickly disappeared. Ralph then raised his wand again and tapped the map lightly with the end, saying, Alohomora. The previously blank parchment now displayed many fine, spiderweb-like ink lines, and then writing began to appear at the top of the parchment, large, curved green letters. The Hogwarts magical map was created by Ralph Scamander, Shirley Swinton, and Hermione Granger. It belongs to Celia's Magical Beasts shop. How do we deal with wizards who try to force the map to appear without knowing the password? Shirley asked again. We can add a fireball charm to the map, Hermione whispered. That way, the map will burn them. Ralph nodded. Let's also add a copy charm. The map can be copied infinitely, so if it's lost, we can easily find it. The three discussed the details for a while. Ralph heard footsteps and looked up into the distance. He saw Professor McGonagall approaching them, accompanied by Minister Fudge and an unfamiliar wizard. That's Thor Crocker. He's a silencer from the Department of Mysteries, Hermione explained. Professor McGonagall mentioned that he was originally supposed to review my time turner application, but he fell ill and became Mr. Roderick Bodle. I wonder what he's doing here. Ralph frowned as he looked at the man named Crocker. Thanks to the 3 generous donors, book friend 20201123211015479 inches, I love a Shiba Inu, and just love wading through water for their generous donations. Chapter 388, The Stolen Time Converter. Ralph had assumed Thor Crocker was sent by Corvinus Gaunt to negotiate a deal with the basilisk. He had even prepared his excuse for refusing, but to his utter surprise, Crocker wasn't there to see Ralph, but rather Hermione. Hermione quickly left, following Professor McGonagall and Thor Crocker to the Transfiguration office. Minister Fudge stayed behind, patting the boy's shoulder enthusiastically and saying with a smile, "Ralph, when I arrived, Wizengamot was holding a meeting of the Order of Merlin to discuss this year's medal recipients. Your name has been approved." Fudge leaned closer, lowering his voice. The Order of Merlin, first class, a done deal. Although he had been fairly certain of winning the medal for some time, Ralph was still overjoyed now that it was confirmed. He grinned broadly. "Thank you for the good news, Minister." Fudge looked at the boy and couldn't help but sigh. Even Dumbledore only received the medal in 1945, after defeating the dark wizard Gellert Grindelwald. Ralph was only 13 years old, yet he had already earned the Order of Merlin, first class, truly terrifying. Fudge was filled with envy. He too longed for an Order of Merlin. The reason was simple. The Order of Merlin was awarded to wizards who made significant contributions to the magical community. Only wizards who had received the medal were eligible to become members of Wizengamot. It was an absolutely elite organization. Even the Minister of Magic couldn't serve forever, and Fudge also wanted to retire and live a peaceful life in Wizengamot. Previously, obtaining the medal was easy. The infamous Arcturus Black, for example, had received it by donating a large sum of gold. But since Dumbledore became the head wizard of Wizengamot, the vetting process had become much stricter. At least, donating money was no longer an option. It seemed that if he wanted to join in the future, he might have to rely on Ralph. Fudge even considered making Ralph his son-in-law, but unfortunately, he didn't have a daughter. He did, however, have a niece of similar age whom he could introduce to him. But Fudge glanced at the girl with the red ponytail not far away and immediately gave up the idea. To be honest, his niece wasn't ugly, but compared to this little girl named Shirley Swinton, she was truly humiliating. Love, unaware of Fudge's thoughts, inquired, "Minister, what brings you to Hogwarts today?" "I'm here to mediate the conflict between Hogsmeade and the Dementors," Fudge sighed. Every day after sunset, the Dementors patrol the streets of Hogsmeade, but the wizards there feel it's affecting their business. "So, they just happened to come and visit you?" Love pretended not to recognize Crocker and deliberately asked, "What about that wizard from earlier? I've never seen him before. Was he the Norer?" "You mean Thor Crocker?" Fudge shook his head. "He's a silent one in the Department of Mysteries. Stay away from him. It's a highly secretive department, even I can't inquire about many things." "Speaking of the Department of Mysteries, I had Dumbledore remind you before." Love paused, then said, "That dark wizard who rescued Peter Pettigrew might try to steal the Time Turner." "Love, you don't need to worry about that." Fudge patted the boy's shoulder and smiled. "The Department of Mysteries has already investigated and found no Time Turners have been lost. Scrimgeour, the Auror director, is even stationed there with a group of Aurors. If that guy shows up there, he'll definitely be caught." Ralph narrowed his eyes. The two chatted for a while longer, and after Sulcrook returned, Fudge left with him. Hermione also returned. She looked depressed and seemed somewhat unhappy. Seeing her like this, Sherry asked softly, "What happened, Hermione?" "My Time Turner," Hermione said dejectedly. "It was just taken away by the Department of Mysteries." Ralph raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Why was it taken? Didn't you tell the Ministry of Magic that dark wizards would try to steal the Time Turner from the Department of Mysteries?" Hermione sighed. "Mr. Thor Crocker meant that since someone wanted to steal it, it wasn't safe for me to have the Time Turner anymore. The Department of Mysteries had to take it back." Hermione rubbed her cheek, feeling half relieved and half disappointed. "Oh well, I'm finding the courses too difficult anyway, so let them take it back." Sherry took Hermione's hand, gently comforting her. Ralph remained silent. That wasn't entirely wrong. The Time Turner was indeed safer with the Department of Mysteries than with Hermione. If that was the case, the Department of Mysteries taking it back seemed reasonable. But his intuition told him something was amiss. "Oh no," Ralph's eyes widened suddenly, and he said in a deep voice, The time turner is going to fall into the hands of Voldemort and Peter Pettigrew. Hermione and Sherry both looked up, staring at Ralph in disbelief. Think about it, we're speculating that Peter Pettigrew from the future will go back in time and rescue himself from the Aurors, Ralph explained. And the rescued Peter, he'll steal a time turner, go back in time, and save himself. That's how the time loop is completed. That means, Ralph's voice was urgent, Peter getting the time turner is a done deal. So where did he get it from? The Department of Mysteries. Sherry frowned. Impossible, Ralph shook his head. Because of my warning, that place is now full of Aurors. It's too difficult for him to steal it from there. From Hermione, Ralph denied. Even more impossible. Dumbledore is at Hogwarts. Peter wouldn't dare to steal it. If you were Peter, what would you do? Steal a time turner that's neither at Hogwarts nor in the Department of Mysteries, Hermione said softly. The time turner that Thorcroc just took from Hermione, Sherry exclaimed. That's right, Ralph nodded. Voldemort and Peter Pettigrew will definitely try to steal that time turner now, it's their best chance, but Minister Fudge is surrounded by Aurors, Hermione said doubtfully. That makes it very difficult, so, there's something wrong with Thorcroc, Ralph said decisively. How did Peter know Hermione had the time turner? He must have found out from Thorcroc. Don't forget he was sick for a while, Ralph said softly. What if Peter attacked him during that time, then controlled him and made him pretend to be sick? Sherry and Hermione remained silent. Ralph pulled a flying broom from the box and said, let's go after them now. Chapter 389 Peter the Little Pettigrew. 2 flying broomsticks suddenly soared into the air. Ralph rode alone on the firebolt, while Sherry and Hermione shared the modified broomstick, and the 3 of them flew rapidly into the sky. Sitting on the broomstick, Ralph was filled with many thoughts. He had pondered for a long time how Voldemort and Peter had obtained the time turner. Could it be a violent infiltration of the Department of Mysteries, like Quirrell's infiltration of Gringotts, or perhaps, like Harry's infiltration of the Ministry of Magic, using Polyjuice Potion to sneak in? Ralph devised many plans, all focusing on the Department of Mysteries, but overlooking Hermione beside him. Perhaps this was a case of being blind to one's own strength? One could only say that controlling the silent men of the Department of Mysteries first, and then taking the time turner from Hermione under the pretext of insecurity, was indeed an extremely clever and ingenious move. Rover, where do we go to find Thorcroc? Shirley asked loudly. Hogsmeade Village, Rover replied, quickening his pace. Fudge said he's going there to mediate between the Dementors and the villagers. Hermione, sitting behind Shirley, hesitated for a moment before asking, Rover, since Voldemort and Peter getting the time turner is already a foregone conclusion, even if we chase after them, we can't stop them, right? That's right, it's indeed destined that they'll get the time turner, Rover said in a deep voice, but it might not be this time. We might be able to stop them, or we might not, but we have to try to know the outcome. Whether they can stop them is one thing, but giving up without even trying is not in Rover's character. Even if we can't stop Voldemort and Peter, we can't let them take the time turner so easily. Ralph narrowed his eyes, gazing into the distance. The early spring mountain wind was still biting, whipping the boy's hair wildly. He said sternly, they'll have to pay a price. A simple sentence was enough to stir the hearts of the 2 girls. Sherry stared at Ralph's retreating figure. Whatever decision he made, she would probably just silently follow, even if it was dangerous. Hermione, who always wanted to beat Ralph, was also extremely impressed. Gryffindor students always liked to talk about courage, but when it came to true courage, none could compare to Ralph. Hermione stared blankly at the boy, a longing she herself might not even realize appearing on her face. The 2 flying broomsticks quickly arrived above Hogsmeade. You stay here. If Peter appears, go after him, Ralph instructed. Remember, don't get too close. After giving his instructions, Ralph circled briefly on his firebolt, then, upon finding Fudge's carriage, plummeted downwards. 2 Aurors stood at the 3 broomsticks' entrance, startled by the flying broomstick accompanied by a thunderous roar. They looked up at the sky, such a fast-flying broomstick, that was incredible. A middle-aged Auror nudged his companion with his elbow and asked curiously, Carbo, you always brag about how fast your improved flying broom is, how does it compare to this one? Carbo was a broomstick enthusiast, having ridden all sorts of brooms on the market. He glanced at the sky and said softly, half a pound versus 8 ounces, 50-50, Troilus, that's half a pound of gold, my improved flying broom, at most 8 ounces of scrap metal, Carbo sighed. Not a chance. Is the difference that big? Truss asked in astonishment. Listen to that popping sound, like lightning flashing across the sky. Tisk tisk, it must be a firebolt. Carbo covered his head with his hands and exclaimed, so rich. I couldn't afford one even with several years' salary. The two were still guessing the owner of the broom when they saw the firebolt hurtling towards them with a whistling sound, finally landing in front of them. The firebolt hovered 2 meters above the ground. A handsome young man in a black robe sat atop a broom, politely inquiring, "Excuse me, is Minister Fudge inside? I need to speak with him urgently." Carbo and Terwa immediately recognized the young man as Rolf Scamander, a daily headline in the Daily Prophet. Mr. Scamander, the minister is inside discussing work with Ms. Rosmerta, Carbo asked. Shall I inform him? If you need to speak with the minister urgently, why bother informing him? Terwa scolded Carbo, then smiled broadly at Rolf. Mr. Scamander, shall I take you in right away? Yes, Rolf nodded. May I ask who you are? Terwa had already opened the door, his face beaming. Just call me Terwa, thank you, Mr. Terwa. Rolf jumped off the firebolt, picked up the broom, and strode towards the bar. Once the two were out of sight, Carbo couldn't help but slap himself. This young man is rumored to be the youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin. Even Minister Fudge treats him with respect. Who knows, he might be the next Dumbledore. I have to go and report this. How inept I am. Rolf followed Terwa into the bar and saw that the so-called business meeting was just Fudge drinking, with Lady Rosmerta sitting beside him. Fudge, slightly tipsy, raised his glass and said, Rolf, what brings you here? Want a drink? Rolf narrowed his eyes, looked around, and said, Mr. Fudge, where's Saul Crook? He just went to the restroom. Fudge frowned. You need to see him, I have some urgent matters to ask him. Rolf immediately drew his wand, tilted his head, and said, Lady Rosmerta, please lead the way. Lady Rosmerta was startled to see Rolf draw his wand and quickly backed away. Fudge also frowned and hurriedly got up to follow. Reaching the restroom, Rolf pointed his wand directly at the wooden door and whispered, Allow open. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Rosmerta froze, seeing two men crammed into the small toilet. Thor Crocker and Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew, holding the time-turner, immediately swung his wand upon hearing the door open, blasting a hole in the wall. He took off running. Thor Crocker, meanwhile, raised his wand, aiming it at Rolf. The boy tilted his head to the right, dodging the spell, then leaped into the air, delivering a knee strike to Crocker's abdomen. Crocker was sent flying, crashing through the wall and onto the street outside the bar. The sight of two men flying out startled passers-by, who scattered in panic. Ralph glanced at the unconscious Crocker, then looked up, his gaze sweeping across the street. Peter was no longer in sight. Ralph waved his wand and shouted, Firebolt, come here. A broom swept through the air, and he leaped onto it, soaring straight into the sky, leaving Fudge, Terwa, and the limp Rosmerta on the ground. A gust of cold wind instantly sobered Fudge, who was still slightly tipsy. He rubbed his cheek and said, Was that Peter Pettigrew? Terwa hesitated for a moment and said, It looks like him. Fudge and Terwa exchanged glances. Wasn't he supposed to be dead? Minister, what should we do next? Terwa asked. Fudge came to his senses. He didn't know why Peter had come back to life, but he still ordered, quickly summon the Dementors and give chase. Ralph rode the firebolt high into the sky. He circled for a moment and soon spotted Sherry and Hermione. The boy flicked his broom and flew swiftly towards the two, catching up in just half a minute. He shouted, Have you caught up with Peter Pettigrew? Sherry and Hermione exchanged a glance. Sherry pointed into the distance, her voice strange. They're over there. Ralph followed Sherry's finger and froze instantly. He saw two wizards standing on a wasteland. One was Peter. The other was also Peter. Chapter 390. Was it intentional or accidental? Ralph descended from the sky, carefully examining the two Peters, his gaze finally settling on their right hands. Although both were Peter Pettigrew, there were obvious differences between them. The Peter on the left looked healthy and even somewhat prosperous, clearly having enjoyed a comfortable life recently. The Peter on the right appeared older and listless, and his right hand, though covered by his robe, a silver hand was faintly visible. The two Peters, one in the present, about to return to the past, the other from the future, about to return to the present. Their timelines were exactly opposite, yet now they stood together in a time warp, a kind of mutual journey. The Peter on the right was clearly very excited. a smug look on his face, his expression almost lewd as he said, "Scamander, aren't you surprised to see us?" "Surprised?" Ralph smiled. "It's just using a time tamper, what's so surprising about that? You already know." The smug look on Peter's face vanished, replaced by terror. "Wormtail, in the past year, I've had many dealings with your future self, so it's not surprising that I know this." Ralph glanced at Peter on his left and chuckled softly. "Look at your future self, he's not as excited as you are. He's suffered too much, endured too much pain, but don't worry, that's the blessing you're about to enjoy." Peter cautiously glanced at his future self, the one who, last summer, disguised himself as a Dexter and rescued him from the Aurors, telling him to head east, to Albania to find the Dark Lord. Peter was terrified when he saw himself, and only after finding the Dark Lord did he realize that he had likely used the Time Turner. It was then that the Dark Lord devised the plan to steal the Time Turner. They first infiltrated the home of the Hump Man, Thor Crook, and directly controlled him with the Imperious Curse. The Dark Lord intended to use Crook to infiltrate the Department of Mysteries, but while examining his memories, he unexpectedly discovered Hermione Granger's application for the Time Turner. So, the Dark Lord changed his plans, controlling Thor Crook and sending him to Hogwarts, where he took the Time Turner under the pretext of safety. This is what Peter experienced after being rescued last summer. He had been living comfortably at Crook's house. But looking at his future self beside him, only a year had passed, yet he seemed to have aged 10 years. What had happened to him? Peter on the left had indeed had a very frustrating year. He was forced to use his retirement savings of over a decade to offer a bounty on Scamander on the black market, and to buy information from Rita Skeeter at a high price to find Nicholas Flamel's manor. Unfortunately, he encountered Scamander and lost an arm. Not long ago, Peter was even forced to have his blood injected to give birth to Voldemort, which took an even greater toll. Peter felt it was pure luck that he was still alive. He even wanted to persuade his self beside him not to use the Time Turner to go back to the past. It was too dangerous. But if he didn't go back, who would rescue him from being sent to Azkaban? Peter Pettigrew was caught in a dilemma. Just then, a hoarse voice came from the right side of Peter's body. "Scamander, you're so smart, why do you have to be my enemy?" "Tom, I'm not your enemy, you took my friend's Time Turner," Ralph chuckled. "Give it back now, and I'll turn around and leave without stopping you." "Wishful thinking," Voldemort said coldly. "You shouldn't call him Tom. Tom, didn't Dumbledore teach you to always use the correct name for things?" Ralph shrugged. "No matter what name you change, you'll always be Tom Riddle. But you did the right thing by changing your name. There are at least 8,000, if not 10,000, people named Tom in all England. I heard even Lucius Malfoy's pet dog is named Tom. Tisk tisk, do you think he did it on purpose or by accident?" "Kill him!" Voldemort's voice trembled with rage. He roared, "Kill him now!" Both Peters raised their wands simultaneously. On the right, he shouted, "Avada Kedavra!" On the left, he yelled, "Dark Light Bolt!" Ralph didn't move his feet, but leaned back, dodging a bolt of crossbow light formed from green light and black mist. The bolt clearly missed its target, but as it passed Ralph, it suddenly veered downwards. Ralph braced himself with his hands on the ground, turning his body to the left, barely avoiding the bolt. The dark light bolt exploded like a cannonball, and Ralph was blown away by the shockwave. However, his body didn't lean back in a straight line. Instead, after his feet left the ground, he glided in a half-arc in the air before landing, his feet light as a dragonfly skimming the water, incredibly graceful and elegant. Ralph's entire body was covered in silver-gray scales, possessing the defense of a fire dragon. This attack was nothing to him. After landing, a ball of lightning appeared in Ralph's hand, condensing into a lightning spear, which he threw, shooting out like an arrow straight at Peter. Peter on the left brandished his wand, and a massive magical wall appeared before him. The wall shattered with a single blow, and the lightning spear, its trajectory slightly altered, pierced the ground, creating a hole as tall as a person and sending dust flying. "Scamander, you can't stop me from using the time turner," Voldemort, hidden in Peter's chest, roared. "You're just wasting your time." Ralph couldn't stop it, it was a fait accompli. But killing Peter on the left was all that mattered. The boy whispered, "Dazzling flash." The magic from the dazzling bird caused Ralph's eyes to blaze with a blinding white light. Although Voldemort and Peter deliberately avoided looking into Ralph's eyes, the dazzling light still shot out, blinding them completely. Ralph brought his fingers together, and another bolt of white lightning crackled. He twisted his wrist, making a whipping motion. A piercing whoosh echoed as the lightning bolt streaked across the sky like a comet, arcing towards Peter and wrapping around his neck. Ralph yanked hard, lifting Peter's feet off the ground, leaving a deep bruise on his neck. The current surged, threatening to char Peter, but blind, he abruptly raised his right arm. His alchemical arm, with a single punch, shattered the pent-up lightning, sending arcs of electricity scattering in disarray. Ralph was about to rush forward when he felt the temperature plummet, a chilling aura seeping into his very being. He looked up, squinting. Hundreds upon hundreds of Dementors were flying in from all directions, lunging at the three combatants. Peter, slumped on the ground, suddenly burst into laughter. "Scamander, you're dead, thanks to A745, and Way for their generous donations." Chapter 391 Ralph, Shirley and Hermione's Patroness. On how to kill Ralph Scamander is a subject Voldemort studied for 2.5 years while lying in the Albanian forest. There are essentially 3 ways to kill someone: do it yourself, hire a hitman, or kidnap a relative for intimidation and threats. According to the Dark Lord's recollections, he had clashed with Scamander several times, the price of which included, but was not limited to, Quirrell's head and Peter's right arm. Last summer, Voldemort had Peter put a high bounty on Scamander's life on the black market. 3 dark wizards went, but Scamander killed 2 of them, one of whom was a werewolf with a transformation buff during the full moon. I gave you the chance to make money, and you were useless. As for kidnapping relatives, Voldemort had indeed considered using Ralph's family to threaten him, such as his elderly grandfather. But considering that his grandfather was Newt Scamander, the Dark Lord thought about it and decided to abandon the idea. After much deliberation, Voldemort finally realized that unless he were resurrected and regained his full strength, killing Scamander now was a hopeless endeavor. However, Peter Pettigrew disagreed. He proposed a bold idea. They had used the time turner to travel back in time, at a point in time when they were certain Ralph would arrive. Why not ambush him? But how? Taking matters into their own hands had proven ineffective. Offering a bounty on the black market was a waste of galleons. Peter focused his attention on the Dementors patrolling day and night. Near Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, there weren't many other things, but Dementors were plentiful, numbering in the hundreds. They could lure them in and surround them. Using memories from the future to set up an ambush, that was the ingenious use of the time turner. And so, seeing hundreds of Dementors swarming towards him, Peter, who had collapsed to the ground, burst into maniacal laughter. "Scamander, you're dead. You can kill dark wizards, you can take down werewolves, you can defeat me, but can you withstand so many Dementors?" Not far away, there was another Peter, holding a time turner, frantically spinning it. It was known that one rotation took 1 hour back, and if he wanted to go back to last summer to save himself from being sent to Azkaban, how many rotations would he need? Peter didn't know. He only knew his mind was in turmoil because a Dementor was sliding towards him. Peter felt a chill run through his body, his breath catching in his chest. The chill quickly penetrated his robes, reaching his chest, and then, the Dark Lord's face. That's right, the Dementor didn't attack Peter. Instead, it was attracted to Voldemort on his chest. The Dementor pulled back its hood, revealing an ugly face, and opened its cherry-like mouth, directly pressing it against the Dark Lord's face, and began to suck hard. Voldemort's eyes widened. He sensed a foul stench emanating from the Dementors' mouths, followed by a powerful suction. A Dementor's kiss could suck away souls, but Voldemort was dead, merely a wandering spirit. His soul wasn't sucked away, instead, his tongue was drawn into the Dementors' mouths. Voldemort whimpered. In all his years, this was the first time he'd ever been kissed. Voldemort mumbled, "Wormtail. Time turner, isn't it ready yet?" Almost, just a little longer, you, damn it, Candle." Voldemort's voice was slurred as he cursed, "You. Couldn't you just randomly go back to a point in time, find a safe place, and then go back to last summer?" "Oh, right," Peter belatedly nodded, quickly releasing the time turner and disappearing with the Dark Lord. Of course, there was also the Dementor that bit its tongue, refusing to let go. Another Peter was also surrounded by Dementors. He used the Nimigus, transforming into a rat. The Dementors stared blankly at the rat, quickly ignoring it and lunging towards Ralph in the distance. Dementors have no eyes, they can only detect wizards by sensing their emotions, but they are unable to detect animals. How did Peter know this? Because a year ago, he used the time turner with the Dark Lord to travel back in time, and the Dementor that had bitten Voldemort followed. Peter had transformed into a rat to escape the Dementor, thus knowing this secret. Glancing at the surrounded Ralph, Peter couldn't help but laugh. The most effective magic against Dementors is the Patronus Charm, but that's a high-level spell, and even adult wizards rarely can cast it. Peter didn't believe Scamander knew that spell. Even if he did, it was impossible to disperse hundreds of Dementors. He would surely die. Enjoy this. Thinking this, Peter scurried towards the pre-prepared rat hole. Seeing Peter trying to escape, Ralph's body crackled with electricity, paralyzing a group of Dementors before quickly giving chase. But halfway through the chase, the boy suddenly remembered something. He immediately abandoned the pursuit and flew into the sky. Above, Sherry and Hermione, riding their flying broomsticks, were also entangled by a group of Dementors. "Palm tops of exile," Hermione shouted. A wisp of silver smoke emerged from the tip of her wand, but the spell didn't fully take effect, it only slowed the attacking Dementors. Sherry glanced at the increasing number of Dementors. Just as she was about to open the black box and take Hermione inside to find the Thunderbird, a crackling sound of electricity suddenly rang out. Ralph, already glowing with bright lightning in midair, fearlessly charged towards the group of Dementors, towards Sherry and Hermione's location, accompanied by thick blue-white arcs of electricity. The villagers of Hogsmeade all came out of their homes. Looking up at the sky from the ground, they saw a ball of lightning attempting to pierce through the dark clouds. The Dementors, though their memories were poor, still recalled that rainy day, that boy with an aura of destruction, especially the Dementor leader. "Scamander is here. Run." The Dementors scattered, and Ralph easily reached Sherry and Hermione, plopping down on his broom. He shouted, "Remember your happiest memories?" Sherry looked at Ralph, recalling that morning in Professor Sprout's greenhouse, when the boy smiled at her and said, "Or, you could be my assistant." The ponytail girl's lips curved into a smile, her eyes gentle. Even now, she still felt those were the most beautiful words in the world. Hermione also suddenly remembered her first encounter with a boy she had bet with outside Platform 9. Ralph, Sherry, and Hermione simultaneously raised their wands and shouted, "Palm tops of exile." From the tips of their 3 wands emerged dazzling silver creatures, a niffler, a unicorn, and an otter. They lowered their heads and charged towards the large group of Dementors. It was reviewed last night, and it's still under review now. It gets reviewed as soon as it's published. I don't think my chapter is overly descriptive. Speechless. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 392: The Broken Time Converter. In the spacious and luxurious headmaster's office, Fudge, having listened to the Auror's report, began pacing back and forth. "Peter Pettigrew is still alive." Fudge uttered 7 unbelievable exclamations, his sweat-drenched face a mask of shock, disbelief, and panic. Since Halloween, he had the major newspapers relentlessly proclaim that Peter Pettigrew had been brought to justice, and now he was suddenly told Peter was alive. Unbelievable. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, and had the testimony of the Silent One, Croc, he wouldn't have believed it at all. Even more outrageous was that Peter had controlled Croc with the Imperious Curse for nearly a year, then today stole the Time Turner, and finally escaped. If this news got out, it wouldn't just be a matter of the public questioning the Ministry of Magic's credibility, it would be a question of how Fudge should gracefully step down and relinquish his position as minister. Fudge suddenly thought of another terrifying thought. His expression turned terrified, and his voice trembled as he asked, "Albus, Peter, could he use the Time Turner to go back to the night the Dark Lord was killed and save him from Harry Potter?" Fudge couldn't imagine what a horrific scenario it would be if the Dark Lord hadn't died and was still alive. Dumbledore, who had just returned from the Ministry of Magic after convening the Wizengamer Conference, looked at the anxious Fudge and comforted him. "Cornell, no matter when Peter used the Time Turner to go back to or what he did, for us now, it's all history, it's the past." Dumbledore's expression was calm and composed as he smiled. "Since in the history you know, the Dark Lord died at Harry Potter's hands, then there's no possibility that Peter could save him." "That's right, you're right, I was too worried." Fudge took a deep breath. No matter what Peter had done, at this moment, it was history he had altered. In this history, the Dark Lord was killed by Potter, unchangeable. Fudge even felt a sliver of relief. Perhaps in another timeline, Crouch would have become minister, and Fudge would have been the one suppressed and marginalized. It was only because Peter changed history that Crouch had the opportunity to become minister. Thinking this way, Fudge felt quite lucky. Fudge cautiously asked, "So, Peter Pettigrew, Cornell, you don't need to worry." Dumbledore sat in his chair, took a sip of tea, showing no signs of languor, yet still exuding ease and composure. Peter was killed by Ralph on Halloween night. For us, this is established history. We not only know the date of Peter's death, but also the location and even the manner of his death. Peter may still be alive now, but in the near future, or even in the distant past, he will still be destined to die. It's fate. Fudge didn't understand Dumbledore's words, but hearing his assessment, he nodded in satisfaction. If Dumbledore said there was nothing to worry about, then what was there to worry about? After all, if the sky fell, the tall ones would hold it up. Fudge then looked at the boy standing in the corner, his face full of apology. "Rolf, are you alright?" When he arrived at the scene with the Aurors, he saw Rolf, Swinton, and Granger, the three of them working together to drive away hundreds of Dementors. Fudge was also shocked. 3 young wizards under the age of 14 could actually summon a complete physical Patronus. Even he couldn't do that. Rolf was one thing, he could even kill werewolves, so he couldn't be judged by common sense. But what about those 2 little girls? Why were they so powerful too? However, considering that they were always by Rolf's side, they must have received his professional, meticulous, and in-depth training, so it seemed reasonable that they had that kind of strength. Fudge wore a broad smile, but Ralph's expression was less than friendly. He said coldly, "Mr. Fudge, I could have caught Peter, but the Dementors stopped me and attacked me and my 2 friends. This is the second time this has happened. Ralph, I'll teach the Dementor leader a lesson and make him apologize to you personally," Fudge said with a forced smile. "How about forgiving them this time?" Ralph, of course, couldn't forgive the Dementors, but he couldn't kill them now, so he had to settle for less and ask for some benefits. "Since you've asked, I can forgive them, but I have a condition." "What condition?" "Just name it," Fudge quickly assured him. "Ralph, as long as it's within my power, I'll take care of it immediately," Ralph said softly. "I want to go to Azkaban." "Azkaban?" Fudge's eyes widened, and he frowned, asking, "What do you want to do in a place like that?" "It's only full of Dementors and criminals. As the 5th house of Hogwarts, only highly qualified individuals were eligible to study in Azkaban. For example, the Death Eaters." Ralph wasn't going to the prison for further studies. He wanted to visit the lake Newt had mentioned, the place where Dementors were born. "Minister, I'm a magizoologist, and I'm very interested in the habitats of magical creatures like Dementors," Ralph explained. This was the first time Fudge had ever seen a wizard interested in Dementors. No wonder he was Newt's grandson. Fudge didn't hesitate much and nodded. "Okay, I agree." Fine, he'd go. It wasn't like Ralph was going to break into prison. After Fudge left the office, Umbridge, who had been waiting in the corridor for a long time, quickly came to greet him. In a sickeningly sweet voice, she said, "Minister, you're out." "Yes, Dolores, is everything settled?" Fudge asked. "It's all taken care of." "Those wizards at Hogsmeade who saw Peter Pettigrew," Umbridge gestured with her arm. "I've had the memory erasers remove their memories." Memory erasers belong to the Department of Magical Accidents and Disasters. According to the Statute of Secrecy, they are responsible for casting forgetting spells on muggles who witnessed magical events. Using forgetting spells on wizards like this is quite rare. But there was no other way. Fudge had been spreading the word that Wormtail was dead for so long, and he didn't want rumors of Peter still being alive to spread. Even a simple lie, once you start telling it, you have to stick to it. "Well done, Dolores," Fudge gave Umbridge an approving look. Although she was ugly, like a toad, she was incredibly capable. Fudge had now become quite fond of this assistant. Umbridge hesitated for a moment, then said in a coquettish voice, "Minister, there's one more thing." "What is it?" "The Dementor leader said they've lost one of their Dementors." "Lost?" Fudge frowned. "Have you checked everywhere?" "Yes, we have," Umbridge nodded. "We counted the Dementors guarding the secret passages, and one is indeed missing. Go find it now," Fudge said sternly. "I don't want to hear any more news of wizards or muggles being attacked by Dementors." "Yes, Minister." Inside the headmaster's office, only Dumbledore and Ralph remained. "Professor Dumbledore, Hermione's time turner was stolen by Voldemort. We might need to apply for another one," Ralph asked doubtfully. Aren't you going to ask Fudge, Ralph, to get a time-turner? We need to apply to the Department of Mysteries. Dumbledore shook his head. Although the Department of Mysteries is nominally under the Ministry of Magic, it has a lot of autonomy, so asking Fudge is useless. Ralph frowned. Will Corvinus Gaunt grant us one? Under the current circumstances, he most likely won't agree to the application. Dumbledore paused, then said, unless we give him the Slytherin basilisk. Ralph continued. That's right. Dumbledore nodded. Ralph narrowed his eyes. That basilisk was a Horcrux, of course, he couldn't trade it to Gaunt. Ralph, since you mentioned the time-turner, it seems you already know what you need to do next, Dumbledore said softly. Yes, Professor, Ralph said calmly, pursing his lips. When I saw my Patronus, I understood everything. Ralph's Patronus was a Niffler, exactly the same as the one he had seen in the headmaster's office on Halloween night. But I don't have a time-turner. How can I? Who says you don't? Dumbledore stood up, smiled at Ralph, flicked his sleeve, patted the boy's shoulder, and gestured for him to walk to the window. Dumbledore looked out at the Forbidden Forest and sighed. What we need is there, though it's broken. Chapter 393 Dumbledore's Girlfriend. If you were to ask who was most affected by Voldemort stealing the time-turner, the answer would undoubtedly be Hermione. She applied for the time-turner to adjust her conflicting class schedules, but now, without it, she had to make choices and drop some courses. Of course, Hermione could have chosen not to. Earning an OWL certificate doesn't require every subject to be an O. Excellent, an A, pass, is sufficient. With Hermione's intelligence, if she didn't strive for excellent in every subject and selectively studied a few, she could easily have obtained 12 OWL certificates by 5th year. Bill Weasley, Percy Weasley, and even Barty Crouch Jr. all did this. They all obtained 12 OWL certificates, but not all of them were OS. However, Hermione is a witch who, once she puts in the effort, will strive for the best in everything. Simply aiming for certificates is not her character or style. So when Ralph found Sherry and Hermione, Hermione told him, I just went to see Professor McGonagall and decided to stop attending Muggle studies and divination classes. That way, I can have a normal schedule again, Sherry said with some regret. Hermione, you've invested so much energy and time, and the final exams are in just over 2 months. It's such a waste to give up now. Well, there's nothing I can do about it. Hermione also felt regretful, so much so that she was annoyed that she hadn't protected the time-turner better and let Crocker trick her into giving it away so easily. Giving up isn't necessarily a bad thing, Ralph said, comforting Hermione, who was feeling down. Learning is like that, you can't try to do everything at once. You can't bite off more than you can chew. It's best to concentrate on what you're good at, savor it slowly, and truly master one subject. Otherwise, no matter how many courses you take or how many certificates you get, you'll just be a walking library. Giving up this time is actually a good thing, Hermione suddenly understood. She looked at the boy, her face full of surprise, and said, Ralph, when did you become a great educator? Sarcastic, huh? Ralph smiled. Okay, actually, I didn't say that. Then who did? Dumbledore gave me an alchemy notebook he wrote when he was in school, didn't he? Ralph explained. I saw this passage in the notebook, thought it made a lot of sense, and wrote it down. Dumbledore wrote it, Hermione asked. It's not his handwriting, Ralph shook his head. It's definitely not the headmaster's handwriting, Shirley chuckled, covering her mouth. I've seen that notebook, the wizard's handwriting is very delicate, it looks like a girl's. Hermione's eyes widened, and she said thoughtfully, could it be Professor Dumbledore's girlfriend from his school days? Ralph's lips twitched. Hermione's imagination was so vivid, it was a shame she wasn't writing novels. Besides, Dumbledore didn't have a girlfriend, he was more like a boyfriend. Wait, could it be Grindelwald's handwriting? It wasn't impossible, after all, to leave reading notes in the young Dumbledore's private notebook. It seemed like no one else but Grindelwald could be the only one. This is amazing. By the way, Ralph, what about the time-turner? Hermione suddenly asked. Can we apply for it again? You still want to use that thing? Ralph narrowed his eyes. No, Hermione shook her head. That Niffler that appeared in the headmaster's office on Halloween night was clearly your Patronus. How did you manage that without a time-turner? Ralph understood Hermione's meaning. He sighed softly. The Department of Mysteries certainly won't approve anymore, but Dumbledore said there's a time-turner deep in the Forbidden Forest, and that one should be usable. A time-turner in the Forbidden Forest? Hermione was astonished. What exactly is the Forbidden Forest? How can it have everything? Broken, not whole, Ralph said. Dumbledore said he could try to repair it. A broken time turner might be beyond repair for other wizards, but Dumbledore is different. He wields the Elder Wand. Even a wand master like Ollivander couldn't repair a wand broken in two, but the Elder Wand's restoration is easily achieved. What are Deathly Hallows anyway? Tactical lean back. Sherry seemed to remember something. She looked up at Ralph, her eyebrows furrowing, and said, "The broken time turner? Is it that huge crater we saw last time?" On Halloween night, a bright light appeared in the Forbidden Forest. Ralph and Sherry later explored the Forbidden Forest and, led by Ronan the Centaur, discovered a giant crater. And that crater contained the power of time. That's what I thought too, Ralph nodded. Whether it's true or not, we'll have to ask Professor Dumbledore. Hermione remained silent. She had heard the two mention this before, and now, hearing it again, her eyes held not only resentment but also envy and grievance. You two went on an adventure in the Forbidden Forest without me. Ralph suddenly remembered something. He smiled slightly and said, "Do you two want to earn some pocket money? I have a simple, easy, and high-return way to make money." Hermione looked up, watching Ralph warily. Usually, when he showed this kind of smile, it meant he was about to scam someone. Sherry knew Ralph wouldn't cheat her, and despite always being short of money, she asked without hesitation, "I want to earn it." "You two should have heard," Ralph said softly, "that some students have started a betting pool, wagering on who will be the first at Hogwarts to summon a complete Patronus charm." Ever since Sirius taught the students the Patronus charm, a wave of learning had swept through the school. Considering the spell's extreme complexity, many adult wizards couldn't learn it. The betting pool arose. "Now, all three of us can use the Patronus charm." Ralph lowered his voice. "I'll bet on myself. Everyone will see that and assume I've already learned it, then they'll all bet on me." He smiled, "But we'll secretly place a huge bet on Sherry. Her odds are the highest among the three of us." Hermione was dumbfounded. "Could they really do that?" She whispered, "I think we're really messing with them." Ralph waved his hand dismissively. "Hermione, a bet's a bet, and they were the ones who made them gamble. Besides, our intentions are good. We're trying to warn them. Gambling is risky. Bet carefully. If we can help them quit gambling, they should actually thank us." Thanks to 4-character nickname is hard to choose, and I have a friend who wants to watch for their generous donations. Chapter 394 R&M, Refund. Hiding in a corner of the corridor, Malfoy and his sidekick Crabbe were huddled together, playing their favorite little game, randomly picking a lucky passerby, and casting a curse. Malfoy always enjoyed watching the students' disheveled state. But today, he didn't use a curse, but rather the Patronus charm, so the entertainment value wasn't as good. Because every time he shouted patron saints, the tip of his wand only emitted a puff of mist, looking less like a humidifier. A second-year student, his face covered in smoke, yelled, "Are you two out of your minds? So shameless. If your parents are still healthy, they should hurry up and have another one." He put his hands on his hips, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly, and spat out a mouthful of stale phlegm that flew onto Malfoy's new shoes. Malfoy was furious. No one had ever dared to speak to him like that before. He glared at his henchman and snarled, "Crabbe, beat him up," but after spitting, the guy turned and ran, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Crabbe, being large and slow, couldn't catch him. "Don't let me run into that kid again, or I'll beat him to pulp," Malfoy roared. "By the way, do you know which house he's in?" "I think it's Hufflepuff," Crabbe said cautiously after a moment's thought. "I saw him sitting at the Hufflepuff table last time, getting Ralph Scamander's autograph." Malfoy fell silent. He cleared his throat and said, "For Scamander's sake, let this kid off this time." Crabbe breathed a sigh of relief. He was afraid Malfoy might act impulsively and try to get himself killed, and then give away his allowance for the month. Malfoy brandished his wand, cleaning his shoes, and shook his arms, saying, "This stupid Patronus charm, why can't I cast it? My wand isn't broken." Malfoy was like a fisherman, unable to cast the Patronus charm for so long. He was now starting to doubt his tools. "Draco, someone's coming again," Crabbe quickly warned. "It's Potter and Weasley." Hearing Harry's name, Malfoy immediately perked up and straightened up. He glanced at the two figures in the distance and excitedly shouted, "Quick, hide!" As the footsteps drew closer, Malfoy jumped out again. This time, it wasn't the harmless Patronus charm, but stand still, dead. Ron's legs were stuck together, as if bound by ropes. He lunged forward and landed hard on the ground with a thud. Malfoy laughed heartily. "Run!" Harry yelled, quickly drawing his wand and shouting, "Grin!" Whoosh! A silver beam struck Malfoy in the stomach, causing him to double over, panting heavily. Crabbe grabbed Harry, but Harry twisted like an eel, kicking Crabbe hard in the groin with his heel. A scream came from behind, and then he broke free. Next, Harry pounced on Malfoy, knocking him to the ground and then landing on top of him. Malfoy thrust upwards from the waist down, slamming into Harry's buttocks, trying to send him flying, but Harry was no pushover either, pressing down hard. Passers-by were dumbfounded by the scene. What were they doing? Fighting or fighting? Percy, who happened to be passing by, rushed over, shouting, "Stop it, all of you! Stop right now!" No fighting in the hallway. Percy was speechless. He couldn't quite describe Harry and Malfoy's actions. Harry and Malfoy were still struggling, completely ignoring Percy. He had no choice but to raise his wand and forcefully separate the two inseparable individuals. Harry, clutching his aching backside, angrily shouted, "Percy!" Malfoy attacked Ron first. Percy glanced at Ron lying on the ground, dispelled the spell, and then looked at Malfoy, saying, "Slytherin, 10 points deducted. I'll tell Professor McGonagall." "Whatever, Professor Snape will add it back anyway," Malfoy sneered, standing up and dusting himself off. Percy seemed offended. "Malfoy, I don't like your attitude. You need to show more respect to the student council president." "Slytherin, deduct 5 points," Malfoy sneered and left with Crabbe. Before they had gone far, Goyle ran towards them. He frowned and asked, "Goyle, where have you been?" "Draco, I just heard some news," Goyle exclaimed. "Scamander, he bet 20 galleons that he'll be the first to release his Patronus." "Really?" "Absolutely," Goyle nodded. "I came here as soon as I heard the news." Malfoy hesitated for a moment, then asked, "How much money do you have on you?" "Hand it all over," Crabbe hesitated. "Draco, you want to bet on Scamander?" "Yes, I've fought Scamander so many times, I know his strength very well," Malfoy said softly. Even though he was the one being beaten, Malfoy made it sound like they were evenly matched. If only one student can learn the Patronus charm, it's definitely Scamander. He's betting on himself now, which means he's already mastered it. Let's hurry and place our bets, otherwise the bet will be over once he uses the Patronus charm in public. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle hurriedly ran off, leaving Harry and Ron staring at each other. "Ron can actually summon a complete Patronus already," Harry exclaimed, somewhat impressed. "No wonder he's like that. He often went to Sirius's office for private lessons, but he always fainted when facing that Dementor." Sirius had recently been thinking of changing Harry's practice partner from the Dementors to a Boggart. "Harry, let's go too," Ron said in a strange voice. "What, you want to bet too?" "Yeah, it's a sure thing," Ron said eagerly. "The news hasn't spread yet, so the odds haven't dropped too much, but in a while, when everyone gets the news, the odds will probably be much lower." "Do you have money?" Harry asked curiously. "I've saved some, though not much." Ron was a little surprised. He used to lose money frequently, sometimes even losing it the night he arrived at Hogwarts after receiving his allowance. But recently, he hadn't lost any money, and he had managed to save some pocket money. "Although it's not much, I've bet it all now, so I can make quite a bit." Ron was very excited. The opportunity to make money was right in front of him, and he couldn't miss it. The news that Scamander had learned the Patronus charm spread rapidly throughout Hogwarts before noon. Hearing that it was a sure thing, many students bet on him. Later, because the odds were too low, they could barely make any money. But some students still followed suit. Just when everyone was eagerly anticipating Ron's use of the Patronus charm, another astonishing piece of news quickly spread throughout Hogwarts. Ravenclaw's Shirley Swinton had used the Patronus charm first, becoming the first student to summon a complete Patronus. The young wizards who had placed bets were in an uproar. They flocked to Gryffindor to confront Lee Jordan and the twins who had run the betting operation, practically shouting, "Damn it, give us our money back. Thanks to the generous donor, Golden City is number 1 for the donation." Chapter 395 Quidditch Melee. This bet, months in the making, ended in a way that surprised everyone. Ron, on whom everyone had placed their hopes, didn't win. Instead, Sherry became the first student in the entire school to use the Patronus charm, effectively ending the match. Countless students who placed bets lost. Malfoy lost the most. He, along with Goyle and Crabbe, had bet hundreds of galleons, boasting all morning about how well-informed and adept at seizing opportunities were. Unexpectedly, just a few hours later, he'd lost everything. The young wizards who had initially followed suit were somewhat annoyed, but after thinking about Malfoy, they felt much better. After all, they only lost a few galleons at most, and a few nuts at least. It was just a game, unlike Malfoy's high-stakes bet. Malfoy was affectionately called Hogwarts, the big fat sheep. Of course, Ron was even more upset than Malfoy. He could just ask his family for more money, he wasn't short of cash. Ron was different. He was frugal, saving up his allowance for a year, all for the World Cup this summer so he could splurge. He even borrowed some galleons from Harry, hoping to get rich overnight with this surefire opportunity, only to lose everything. Ron, already struggling financially, was now even worse off. He was filled with regret and vowed never to gamble again. Of course, some students suspected Ron and Sherry had conspired to set up the scheme. But the thing is, Ron bet on himself, not on you to follow suit. It just goes to show, gambling is risky, bet with caution. This incident caused quite a stir, but thankfully, the upcoming Quidditch tournament drew everyone's attention away. This was the final tournament of the semester. Currently, the highest scoring team was Hufflepuff Quidditch, leading Gryffindor by only 90 points and Slytherin by 200. Ravenclaw remained in the top 4, their performance incredibly consistent. Aside from Ravenclaw definitely finishing last, the rankings of the top 3 teams were not final. The final match will determine how many points Gryffindor and Slytherin score. If they're lucky and both teams achieve a high score, they could overtake the current leader, Hufflepuff, and advance to the finals. Therefore, Hufflepuff's fate now hinges on the results of other teams. However, this is unlikely, as Gryffindor's overall strength far surpasses Slytherin's, and they are unlikely to engage in collusion to help their arch-rivals, Slytherin, rack up points. Slytherin, in turn, wants to crush Gryffindor and advance directly to the finals. As direct competitors, their animosity is at its peak. Gryffindor was already Snape's least favorite house, and now, he hates it even more. He launches a vicious point deduction attack, attempting to affect Gryffindor's mentality, and he frequently puts Harry in solitary confinement. Sirius Black is equally relentless, harassing Malfoy in every class, as if he were not his nephew but an enemy. The two houses were rife with tension, frequently clashing in the hallways and stairwells. This tit-for-tat rivalry continued until Saturday's match. The Slytherin Quidditch team took martial arts to the extreme, turning the match into a boxing match. Within 10 minutes, they had injured Angelina with their bats and knocked Ariel off her broom. Gryffindor was no less formidable. The twins, riding on their flying brooms, secretly threw out prank items, including a dung ball disguised as a running ball that exploded in the air. Were you playing a Quidditch props contest? Mrs. Hooch had no choice but to call fouls repeatedly, shattering the match. The Slytherin Quidditch team is really dirty. The world of freestyle fighting would be a huge loss without them, Lee mocked, microphone in hand. And that flying kick Derek just gave Wood, it hit him in the stomach. I suspect it even ripped the seams off his shoes. However, when George slapped Malfoy across the face, Lee immediately switched gears, Malfoy attacking George's hand with his face. That's so despicable. Go poke his eye, Fred. Just kidding, Professor McGonagall, it's a joke. Oh, no. Flint has the ball. Flint is flying towards the Gryffindor goal. Come on, Wood, save the ball, but Flint scored, and a cheer erupted from the Slytherin side. Lee Jordan cursed fiercely, and Professor McGonagall tried to snatch the microphone from him. He dodged and apologized. I'm sorry, Professor, I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. Wait, Lee suddenly shouted, what's that? Dementors. Everyone turned to look, and saw 2 Dementors in robes appear in the arena, approaching Harry. Harry reached under his robes, quickly drew his wand, and roared, Palm Tops of Exile. A silvery mist shot from the tip of his wand, striking the Dementors. They fell to the ground, revealing Goyle and Crabbe. Draco Malfoy, perched on his flying broomstick, saw his plan had failed and cursed, fool, Professor McGonagall, forgetting to reprimand Lee, her face contorted with rage, shouted, despicable tactics. A scheme to frame the Gryffindor Seeker, a vile and cowardly act. You will all be punished, and Slytherin will lose 50 points. Potter used his wand. Professor Snape yelled urgently, he fouled. He must be sent off. This was true. According to Quidditch rules, players could bring their wands onto the field, but under no circumstances could they use them against opposing players, their broomsticks, or the spectators. But Snape's words were drowned out by the clamor. The stands erupted in chaos, a cacophony of boos, jeers, and angry shouts. The Gryffindor and Slytherin students began fighting. Seeing the spectators fighting, the Gryffindor and Slytherin players, disregarding everything else, joined in the aerial battle. What was supposed to be a Quidditch match had turned into a chaotic brawl. Sirius Black left the Gryffindor stands and strode towards Snape, drawing his wand. Snape countered with his. "Come on, Severus, you coward, I've waited too long, Black, one-on-one today, let's settle this score." Lee, still commentating, shouted, "Professor Black is leading a brawl between Gryffindor and Slytherin students. He's up against Snape, beat him up." Professor Black, sitting in the Hufflepuff stands, Captain Cedric seemed even more excited than the Gryffindor and Slytherin students. He pumped his fist, cheering, "Fight, fight already." Ralph looked on, speechless. "Cedric, why are you so excited, Ralph? If they fight, they'll be suspended." Cedric put his arm around Ralph, laughing loudly. "We've definitely won the final. We're the champions." Chapter 396 Is Dumbledore Getting Old? Snape and Sirius stood on the Quidditch pitch, beginning their first deadly duel in 12 years. Sirius launched the first attack, a black moonbeam flying towards Snape. After being deflected, he immediately fired a second spell, which was blocked by a magical shield. Sirius's attacks were ferocious and swift, darting up and down, left and right, but Snape blocked them all. The light of the spells danced and bounced back to the ground, and students scattered, quickly clearing a large area around the two. After several rounds, the tide turned. Snape switched from defense to offense, flames filling the air, almost licking Sirius's hair and forcing him to retreat. Snape brandished his wand, and the flames transformed into a fiery serpent in midair, howling as it lunged at Sirius. Sirius raised his wand above his head, using the ironclad charm to block the serpent's impact, a deafening roar echoing across the pitch. Sirius Black launched another counterattack, but Snape easily blocked it with a flick of his wand, a flash of white light erupting from his head like lightning. Many students cheered excitedly, encouraging the professor. "Kill him! Kill him! Professor Snape, give Black a good beating, go! Go! Professor Black! Teach Snape a lesson." As time passed, Snape's movements became faster and faster, and Sirius could only barely defend himself. This was normal. Sirius was only in his early 20s when he was imprisoned, having graduated from Hogwarts a few years prior. His strength was still in a phase of rapid growth, but before he could fully develop it, he was directly imprisoned in Azkaban. Furthermore, due to the influence of the Dementors, Sirius's strength declined rapidly, perhaps even less than his 18-year-old self. But in those 12 years at Hogwarts, Snape hadn't wasted his time, continuing to hone his magical skills. Whether in experience or dedication to magical research, the current Sirius was far inferior to Snape. Seeing Sirius looking somewhat disheveled, a frantic Harry flew in on his firebolt. He drew his wand, pointed it at Snape, and shouted, "Expelliarmus," but he missed. The spell flew over Snape's head. Snape sneered, "A sneak attack? Potter, you want to follow your filthy father's example and gang up on me with Black, don't you?" I said no, no. With a loud bang, Harry was sent flying backward, crashing heavily to the ground, his wand flying from his hand. But Snape didn't strike hard. Harry quickly got up and limped towards his wand. Seeing that Harry was alright, Sirius breathed a sigh of relief. His voice was hoarse as he said, "Don't come any closer, Harry. This is Snape and I fighting, you're not allowed to interfere." "It's alright, Black. Anyway, you only dared to attack me with Potter back then, never one-on-one," Snape said with utter contempt. "Sirius, you should wear a dress and be a woman, then I'll go easy on you," Sirius spat and said menacingly. "Die." Just then, accompanied by a flash of fire, Dumbledore appeared on the Quidditch pitch. "Stop it, both of you. Stop it immediately," but Snape and Sirius were already enraged. They ignored Dumbledore, continuing to circle around, attacking and leaping, spells flying, and shouting insults. Dumbledore's expression remained calm and composed, but his deep blue eyes were filled with disappointment and anger. He walked slowly towards the two, reached out and grasped a wand, then gently waved it. A silver flash swirled across the arena, followed by a thunderous roar that shook the ground. In the explosion, Dumbledore, his hair and beard as white as snow, His robes billowing in the wind, exuded a terrifying, imposing aura, a stark contrast to his usual gentle and benevolent demeanor. When the dust settled, Ralph looked back at the center of the arena and gasped. Snape and Sirius, who had just been fighting tooth and nail, lay motionless on the ground, unconscious. The death match had begun abruptly and ended just as quickly, leaving everyone stunned. The Quidditch arena fell into deathly silence. Fawkes the Phoenix circled overhead, chirping softly, its tone ambiguous, whether pitying or mocking. Professor McGonagall, in the distance, sighed. She hadn't seen Dumbledore fight in years. Did she really think he was old? These youngsters, ignorance is bliss, Dumbledore said in a deep voice. Minerva, take them both to the school hospital. If they want to fight again, have Madame Pomfrey give them the water of death and resurrection, the highest concentration, so they can have a good sleep. McGonagall's face was already as pale as a mushroom, so it was hard to tell if she had become even paler. She nodded slightly and said, yes. Dumbledore turned and left without a word, his steps heavy. The great melee between Gryffindor and Slytherin had come to an end. To everyone's surprise, the most seriously injured were Snape and Sirius. This was the first time the students had seen Dumbledore fight, and with just one spell, he had knocked out 2 wizards in their prime. It was simply too exaggerated. So much so that those students who always said Dumbledore was old and that they could defeat him with a disarming charm and a slide tackle quickly shut up. In this melee, Malfoy took advantage of the chaos to catch the golden snitch and win the match. Unfortunately, their combined points didn't surpass Gryffindor's, and they still failed to reach the finals. But Malfoy didn't care. All he knew was that he'd beaten Potter, a victory he could boast about for the rest of his life. Snape and Sirius, after regaining their senses, wanted to fight again, but Madame Pomfrey forced them into a powerful potion of life and death, and they slept for a day and a night before they dared not provoke him again. However, Snape firmly believed that Harry had used his wand during the match, attacking Goyle and Crabbe. As a student already under punishment, he should be expelled. Professor McGonagall, however, argued that Goyle and Crabbe weren't spectators, but attackers, and Harry was entitled to retaliate. Knowing he couldn't turn the tide, Snape further argued that the Slytherin Quidditch team had to be suspended for fighting. Similarly, Gryffindor should also be suspended. They'd all die together. He'd rather Hufflepuff win than Gryffindor. Professor McGonagall was now speechless. Ultimately, 5 Slytherins and 4 Gryffindors were suspended from the Quidditch Cup, including the twins, Harry and Angelina. Before the Easter holidays, Hufflepuff House held a grand party, opening champagne halfway through the night to celebrate their Quidditch Cup victory a month early. Chapter 397 Sirius's Will. Easter holidays were fast approaching. In the last 2 days before the holidays began, the students could once again visit Hogsmeade Village, but no one was very happy. Because, the professors had assigned far too much homework. The professors clearly believed that the students' fighting was purely out of boredom. If most of the day was spent doing homework, who would have the time to fight? Professor McGonagall's assignments helped the students review the Transfiguration course content for the year. If they finished it all, they wouldn't have to waste time reviewing for the final exams. Professor Sprout had brought out nearly 20 years' worth of herbology final exam questions. According to her, if they could go through them all, they would definitely get a perfect score. Even the usually mild-mannered Professor Flitwick had become strict. After all, the Ravenclaw Quidditch team had once again fallen short in the Final Four. Every year around Easter, he felt particularly down and desperately needed to vent his emotions. Professor Snape went even further, assigning 7 potions papers, each no less than 10,000 words. The young wizards couldn't help but groan. Before, papers were 2 feet long, and everyone could adjust the font size to make the parchment appear fuller. But now, with a word limit, it was incredibly frustrating for someone like Ralph, who struggled to write even 4,000 words a day. However, before the holidays, Lupin returned to Hogwarts with news Ralph had been waiting for. In the headmaster's office, Dumbledore sat engrossed in a letter. Ralph sat beside him, having already read it, chatting with Sirius and Lupin. Lupin, holding a cup, took a sip of his potion and chuckled. "Sirius, I heard you got beaten up and hospitalized not long ago?" Sirius glanced at Dumbledore, who was reading a letter, then cautiously lowered his voice and said, "Professor Dumbledore was too rough. I'm a Gryffindor student, after all. He shouldn't have gone easy on me." "Who told you to fight with Snape?" Lupin said gleefully. "How many times have I told you? You're a professor now." Fighting like this will leave such a terrible impression on the students. It's not all my fault, is it? Sirius spread his hands, complaining. Snape provoked me time and time again, and your wolfsbane potion, every time I drink it, I get diarrhea for days. And Harry, not to mention, Snape picks on him in every class, deliberately bullying Harry. I've wanted to teach Snape a lesson for ages, but you were the one who got a lesson. Lupin smiled. If Dumbledore hadn't shown up in time, you would have been humiliated in front of the whole school. Sirius sighed. He didn't want to admit it, but he was no match for that snotty-nosed devil. Lupin picked up his cup and took another sip. The potion was too bitter, making him shiver. He sighed. It's a pity I can't add sugar. Lupin was taking wolfsbane, taken a week before the full moon. Even when a werewolf is in wolf form, he retains his sanity. Wolfsbane tastes very bitter, but sugar can't be added, otherwise it will render the potion ineffective. Actually, you could add some artificial sweeteners invented by Muggles, Ralph suggested. Those sweeteners have a sweet taste, but their composition is completely different from sugar, so they won't render the wolfsbane ineffective. In his previous life, Ralph loved drinking sugar-free cola. After getting used to it, drinking sugary cola felt cloying, and too sweet. Those cola drinks contain the artificial sweetener aspartame, which is completely different from sugar but provides sweetness. Really? Lupin asked with interest. Then we can definitely give it a try. The three chatted for a while about where to get the sugar substitute. Dumbledore had finished reading the letter and leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. The letter was from Peter Pettigrew. It was addressed to the Death Eater Gibbon. Last summer, Gibbon accepted Peter's bounty and, along with the dark wizard Fanny and the werewolf Fenrir Greyback, came to Hermione's house to kill Ralph. Ralph killed the two, but Gibbon escaped. After Lupin returned from the Romanian Dragon Sanctuary, he had been helping Ralph track down Gibbon until he finally captured him before Christmas last year. Ralph devised a plan to have Lupin control Gibbon and keep in touch with Peter. Now, after half a year, it was finally going to come in handy. Peter asked Gibbon to kidnap Harry while he was visiting Hogsmeade. This was a good opportunity to use Gibbon to track down Peter Pettigrew. Rolf, I agree with your plan. Dumbledore looked at the boy approvingly. He had already done a remarkable job of using Gibbon to seduce Peter. But we can't actually take Harry to see Peter, Sirius objected. That's too dangerous, he volunteered. I can use Polyjuice Potion to transform into Harry, then I'll impersonate Gibbon, Lupin added. We'll go see Peter together, okay, but I must remind you both. Dumbledore paused for a moment, then said, Voldemort is with Peter, and although he's in bad shape and has lost most of his power, he's still quite dangerous. Professor Dumbledore, do you think I'm afraid of death? Sirius laughed nonchalantly. I'll do anything to kill Peter. No. I won't allow it. In the portrait of the headmaster, a goatee-wearing wizard suddenly opened his eyes and said, You're the only boy in the Black family. If you die, the Black bloodline will end. You must at least leave a son before you die. Phineas, I've already been removed from the family tree by my mother. Are you sure I'm still black? Sirius laughed. Nonsense, you're my great-great-grandson, the last member of the Black family, Phineas roared. You've inherited the property and the old house, and now you're denying you're black. Don't worry, Phineas, I've already made my will, Sirius said with a grin. If I die, half the estate will go to my godson Harry, and the other half to Ralph, who saved me. You don't need to worry about your accumulated fortune having no heir. I've arranged everything perfectly for you. Phineas glared at Ralph, as if he were a scapegoat. Ralph was also surprised. This was the first time Sirius had mentioned he could inherit half of the Black family fortune. I absolutely disagree, Phineas shouted. You're my great-great-grandson, you have to listen to me. Sirius suddenly laughed, grinning mischievously. Great-great-grandson or not, are we even that close? Sirius, you beast, Phineas yelled. If I'd known, I would have thrown your grandfather against the wall back then. If you say another word, I'll destroy your picture frame at 12 Grimwald Place, Sirius threatened. I'll make sure you never return to the Black family home. Sirius and Phineas continued their verbal sparring. Watching this scene, Ralph couldn't help but sigh. The Black family was truly a picture of grandfather-grandson harmony. Chapter 398 Ralph, Sherry, I'll miss you. After leaving the principal's office, Ralph returned to his trunk and found Sherry in a canyon. She was feeding the dragon Norbur, her wand waving and sending half-meter-long carnivorous slugs flying into the sky. Norbur hung upside down on a cliff face like a giant bat, its claws deeply embedded in the rock. Smelling the food, Norbert suddenly opened its bright red, charcoal-like eyes, wisps of smoke rising from its nostrils, then spewed dragon fire from its mouth like a dazzling orange-yellow storm. The carnivorous slugs instantly charred, falling downwards in a ring of flame, filling the air with the smell of roasted meat. Before the charred slugs even touched the ground, Norbert had already swooped down, biting off the cooked food, then flapping its massive black dragon wings and soaring into the sky. Rolf went to Sherry's side and helped her feed Norbert. The mountain of food in the cart was gradually decreasing. After feeding the slugs, the two walked along a quiet path towards the airbird's habitat. Shirley whispered, "Rolf, I saw Norbert circling above the meadow for a long time today, staring at those ream cows." Rolf looked up at the huge black shadow soaring in the sky and sighed, "That girl's asking for it again. I'll warn her not to mess with those ream cows again, or I'll petrify her for a while." This wasn't the first time Norbert had done something like this. Rolf had gotten a few goats from Aberforth, supposedly to raise them, but really he wanted to make a hot pot for winter. But after only a couple of days, Norbert, the goat thief, ate them all. Now she was eyeing the ream cows. Ream cows were extremely precious magical creatures. They provided Rolf and Shirley with high-quality milk every day. They couldn't let Norbert take advantage of them. Sherry covered her mouth and chuckled. Norbert probably doesn't like eating carnivorous slugs. That was true. Carnivorous slugs are still slugs, covered in slime. Their meat couldn't possibly be good. "It's alright, I've already discussed it with Aragog. He'll provide us with 8-eyed giant spider meat," Rove laughed. "We won't feed Norbert slugs anymore." Despite their ferocious and ugly appearance, the 8-eyed giant spider is also known as the Scottish land hairy soft-shell crab, enormous in size, with delicious meat. Everyone who's tried it raves about it. With 8-eyed giant spiders as food, there's no need for Norbert to be picky and attack other magical creatures. "Aren't those 8-eyed giant spiders all Aragog's descendants?" Sherry asked in surprise. "He's really willing to provide us with food." "Sherry, 8-eyed giant spiders are vicious. If their numbers increase, they'll kill each other," Rove explained. "This is why, despite their powerful reproductive ability and lack of natural predators in the Forbidden Forest, their numbers remain limited. They all die in internal strife." 8-eyed giant spiders don't eat the corpses of their own kind," Ralph said softly. "Those 8-eyed giant spiders that are killed, Aragog either doesn't give them to us or just throws them away." 8-eyed giant spiders possess high intelligence and understand human language, yet they aren't categorized as human like fairies or vampires, but rather as beasts, precisely because they cannot overcome their ferocious nature. This innate nature also makes Aragog indifferent to the lives of their offspring, just a bunch of tool spiders. They die and regenerate. "By the way," Ralph paused, then said, "Speaking of the reproduction of 8-eyed giant spiders, I suddenly remembered something else." Seeing the boy's serious expression, the girl with the ponytail thought it was something important, so she pricked up her ears and listened intently. He said softly, "Norbert is already an adult. According to the growth cycle of fire dragons, she'll be in here in a few months. We should find her a male fire dragon to breed with." "Sherry, fire dragons leave their juvenile stage and enter adulthood at 2 years old, and then soon experience their first heat. When they're in heat, they're extremely irritable, especially the female fire dragons, who are absolutely terrible. If Rove didn't want his enclosure destroyed, he'd have to quickly find a male fire dragon to help Norbert vent her frustrations. Of course, Rove, as the keeper, could also take matters into his own hands, but this was Norbert's first heat cycle since adulthood, and giving her toys directly would be too inhumane. Rove had promised Hagrid he'd take good care of his daughter, and he had to make sure Norbert was comfortable and well fed. Native British dragons are out of the question, Rove thought for a moment, then shook his head in rejection. Welsh green dragons, they're all green and too ugly. The Hebrides black dragons would be good, but they're too prone to fighting and violence. Ukrainian Iron Belly is the largest fire dragon, with a good physique that could satisfy Norbert, but its intelligence is lacking. A big, dumb oaf. Rolf rested his chin on his hand, pondering. "I spent a long time in the Romanian dragon sanctuary, and I've developed a fondness for the Romanian longhornosaurs. They're quite nice, and it's good to keep the good stuff within the dragon's own territory. What do you think, Sherry? Aren't you going to Austria with Dumbledore this summer?" Sherry hesitated. "How about you go to Norway first? If you're not in a rush, that makes sense. Norbert is a Norwegian Spinosaurus. She might not like other types of dragons." Rolf's eyes lit up. "It would be best if we could steal, cough cough, a Norwegian Spinosaurus. willing to be a live-in son-in-law. Shirley, let me tell you, breeding is something that requires extreme caution. Different types of dragons are also different sizes. The girl with the ponytail stared blankly at the rambling Ralph. Naive, she was so embarrassed listening to the boy impart his breeding secrets that she almost ran away. And last time, when he taught her how to stimulate and milk the cows of Reem, Shirley, who had been watching, was so ashamed that she couldn't sleep for several nights. She dreamt of Ralph's lewd actions. The girl with the ponytail felt complicated, a mix of melancholy and resentment. She was still just a child. Fortunately, the two finally arrived at the winged bird's habitat. Shirley quietly exhaled and gently rubbed her burning cheeks. The winged bird's habitat was on a towering cliff, where it had dug a nest large enough for itself to sleep in using its claws. Seeing Ralph and Sherry arrive, the winged bird flapped its wings with a snapping sound, suddenly opened them, and flew downwards. As it landed, the flapping wings created a gust of wind, raising clouds of dust. Around the bird's neck was a large Elizabethan collar made of a special material. This was worn by animals after surgery or during illness to prevent them from scratching their wounds. Thick bandages were wrapped around the bird's abdomen. This winged bird had been attacked by a dark wizard, and Nymeria, unable to heal it, had asked Ralph for help, which he had brought back to the box. After carefully re-examining the injuries, Ralph said softly, "Sherry, its injuries are almost healed. If I don't return within 3 days, remove the bandages and take off the Elizabethan collar." "Okay, I've got it." The girl with the ponytail nodded, wrote it down in her notebook, and then asked curiously, "Ralph, are you leaving school for the Easter holidays?" "I do need to go out," Ralph nodded. He quickly recounted the plan devised in the headmaster's office. Sherry already knew about it, so there was no need to hide it. Sirius had ultimately decided to impersonate Harry and go with Lupin to see Peter, then seize him. Phineas, of course, vehemently opposed it, his mind preoccupied with the fear of the Black family bloodline dying out, but he was merely a portrait and couldn't stop Sirius. The plan wasn't actually as dangerous as it seemed. Since Peter had asked Gibbon to take Harry, it meant Voldemort wanted to resurrect, and he was probably in his infant form now, with little fighting ability. Sirius and Lupin only had Peter to deal with, greatly reducing the danger. Sherry thought for a moment, then frowned slightly. "But this plan can't succeed, can it? We killed Peter last Halloween. That's something that's already happened. He was destined to die on that day. If Sirius and Lupin capture Peter this time, he won't have died last year." "That's right," Ralph smiled and said, "So, my mission is to use the time turner to go back to last Halloween, and then use the Patronus charm to notify us to go to the Screaming Shack, which Peter was killed in the Screaming Shack on Halloween night?" This was a question Ralph had pondered for a long time. You see, at that point in time, at least two Peters existed simultaneously in one space-time. One was the Peter living in the present, the other was the Peter from the future. But it turned out that neither of those Peters died, living until the day they stole Hermione's time turner, successfully completing a year-long time loop. Ralph thought for a long time, untangling this mess, and finally deduced, there was another Peter from the even future, who used the time turner again, returning to Halloween night. At that point in time, 3 Peters were alive simultaneously. What Ralph had to do was guide his past self to completely kill the 3rd Peter. Sherry fell silent, biting her lip, and said, "Ralph, can I go back with you? I can help too." "No," Ralph shook his head. "This time it's not the Forbidden Forest, we might be facing Voldemort. It's dangerous, you can't go." The girl with the ponytail didn't speak, but lowered her head and gently kicked a small pebble at her feet. It landed in the lake not far away, splashing water. "Shirley, you can stay at Hogwarts and help me too," Ralph said, looking at the girl's dejected mood. "I won't take the trunk back this time, I'll leave it with you. You have to take care of those magical creatures." Ralph took out a key and handed it to her, saying, "This is the key to the trunk, you take it. If I leave and those creatures try to escape, use this key to lock the trunk securely." Shirley took the key in a daze, and whispered, "Can I manage it?" She used to be just a little helper. With Ralph's help, he could solve any problems she encountered. But now the boy is going back to the past, and who knows when he'll be back. Sherry was a little unsure if she could handle so many magical creatures. Ralph gently raised a hand, pressed it against the girl's head, and patted it. He smiled broadly, his expression encouraging, and said, "Of course you can, Sherry. You're the assistant I've chosen." No girl at Hogwarts is better than you. Sherry tilted her head slightly, gazing into Ralph's eyes, as if trying to confirm if he was lying, before suddenly smiling brightly. The girl with the ponytail, her bright eyes misty and shy, biting her thin lips with an innocent look, made Ralph momentarily lose his composure. So beautiful. Sherry suddenly remembered something, and she reached out her slender fingers to grab a silver chain from around her neck. Ralph, the nuns at the convent said that when they found me, I was wearing this, and I've always worn it as a protective charm. Wearing it will protect you. Ralph took the pendant, still faintly warm with the girl's body heat and scent, and gently stroked the cross at the end of the silver chain. Shirley blushed slightly. She had worn this pendant close to her body for over a decade, never taking it off, and this was the first time she had given it to someone, a boy no less. Thank you, Ralph said, putting the pendant around his neck. He gazed quietly at the shy girl with the ponytail and smiled. Will you walk with me a little longer? Shirley nodded obediently. Neither of them spoke, walking quietly side by side along the secluded path lined with the willows by the lake. A cool breeze rippled the surface of the lake. The sky had darkened, and the dome above the box, with its ceiling like the Great Hall of Hogwarts, reflected the starry sky like a cascading stream. Ralph admired the view, his hands behind his head, unusually relaxed, his head swaying gently like a blade of grass in the breeze. Just then, Ralph noticed Shirley tugging at his sleeve. He stopped and turned to ask, "What's wrong?" The girl with the ponytail twisted Ralph's sleeve, her head lowered, her expression unreadable, the breeze ruffling her hair. "Ralph, you must come back soon." "Yeah, don't worry, maybe I'll leave tomorrow and come back the day after." Ralph raised his arm and gently smoothed a strand of hair from Shirley's temple, then reached out and lightly grasped the ponytail that hung to her chest. He smiled and said, "I'll miss you." Shirley's pretty face flushed, and she suddenly took a step forward, hugged the boy tightly, and murmured, "Ralph, I'll miss you too." The rippling lake water caressed the rocks protruding from the surface, making a splashing sound. At that moment, the starry sky was dazzling, and the boy and girl embraced each other quietly, a bit of writer's block. Here's a 4,000-word chapter for now. Thanks to WFSMTINF, and for their generous donations. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 399 Sirius Blackbitten. Standing before a dilapidated grave, Peter Pettigrew bent over, carefully examining the name on the tombstone. The deceased had been dead for half a century, the grave had long been neglected, brown weeds growing from the cracks in the tombstone, and twisted, thorny trees clinging stubbornly to it, making the name difficult to decipher. But this was about finding the Dark Lord's father. If he went to the wrong grave, it wouldn't be as simple as a crucifixion. Therefore, Peter was extremely attentive, his face almost pressed against the tombstone before he could finally make out the words Tom Riddle. "Damn Tom, finally found you." "Master, I found your father," Peter exclaimed excitedly. "This is the grave." "Very good, Wormtail," a cold, gentle voice sounded. "Quickly, lift me up, let me see my long-lost Muggle father." "Yes, Master." Voldemort, only the size of an infant, was held in Peter's arms, his red eyes fixed on the desolate grave. Voldemort, curled up in the wool blanket, chuckled mockingly. "Good day, Father. Long time no see. How have you been?" Peter glanced at the grave, and a single thought inexplicably popped into his mind. "How have you been?" Fortunately, he held back, not uttering it aloud. "Father, you should be pleased to see me like this. I've been stripped of my flesh, worse than a ghost, worse than the lowest wandering spirit," Voldemort murmured weakly. "Perhaps this is retribution for a son killing his father." The Dark Lord surveyed the graveyard, his snake-like face twisting into a cruel smile. "But fate has been merciful. I left you a whole body back then, such a small act of kindness, yet it saved me. See how useful you are after death. Wormtail, open my father's grave." "Yes, Master." Peter waved his wand, the grave split open, and a complete corpse floated out of the coffin, landing on the ground. Peter carried Voldemort over, but accidentally stepped on a bone, crushing it to ashes with a crack. Peter quickly took a step back, looking nervously at the Dark Lord. "It doesn't matter, Wormtail. You can stomp on his grave, not just step on him," Voldemort hissed softly. He was just a muggle and a fool. I killed him back then. Do you know why I killed my father? Because, Peter guessed, he was a muggle. No, Voldemort said softly, because he abandoned my mother, causing her to die in childbirth, leaving me to grow up alone in a muggle orphanage, enduring endless ridicule and sarcasm. Voldemort suddenly snapped, "Tell me, did he deserve to die?" After an awkward silence, a trembling Peter managed to say, "He deserved to die, so, I swore to find him, to take revenge." Voldemort said with a cold expression, "My mother should have done the same, but she was just a woman, too soft-hearted. Men need revenge. When I was 16, I finally found my father. He and his family were having dinner when I suddenly burst in. I asked my father, 'Why did you abandon me and my mother?' Voldemort's face was itched with sorrow, but it gradually twisted, his eyes filled with venom. He called me a bastard. I raised my wand, pointed it at my father's chest, and told him, 'Say the word bastard again, and I'll kill you.' He still called me a rotten whore's bastard." Voldemort's lips curled into a horrible grin. "So I killed him, killed the one who gave me the same name as him. Tom Riddle, with Avada Kedavra. That was the first time I killed someone myself. The feeling of killing my father was wonderful." Hell, Peter trembled, wishing he could cover his ears. After all, the Dark Lord's past was not something anyone could hear. He feared being silenced. After a long silence, Voldemort seemed listless. He whispered, "Put me and my father in the cauldron." "Yes, master." Peter waved his wand, conjuring a huge stone cauldron, which he placed before the grave. Clear as water, Peter waved his wand, first filling the cauldron with water, then taking a potion from his pocket and adding it in. The water immediately turned murky. Peter carefully removed the blanket, placed the naked Voldemort into the cauldron, and picked up a bone from the ground, tossing it in as well. Then, he pulled open his robes, used a silver knife to cut a piece of flesh from his chest, and let it fall into the cauldron. Voldemort floated in the cauldron, satisfied. "Very good, now only the enemy's blood is needed." Peter applied white styrax to the wound on his chest to stop the bleeding. He then picked up a mirror and whispered, "Master, they have arrived at the agreed place." It was a magical mirror. The mirror showed a wide, flat area where Gibbon and Potter were anxiously waiting. Peter was afraid Gibbon would bring horrors, so he was extremely cautious and couldn't possibly let them come directly to this graveyard. "Guide them both here," Voldemort's cold voice held an impatient tone. "Hurry, I can't wait any longer." "Yes, master." Peter gently waved his wand. Standing on an open, flat area, Lupin, disguised as Gibbon, looked around, waiting for Peter to appear. Just then, a stone floated up and flew to his side. Lupin narrowed his eyes and said, "The portkey." It seemed Peter didn't intend to show himself, but rather to guide them to another place. So cautious? Holding the portkey would lead to an unfamiliar place, which meant the unknown and danger. Not holding the portkey meant it was impossible to find Peter. To go or not to go? Lupin didn't hesitate much. He grabbed Sirius, disguised as Harry, and reached out to grasp the portkey. The two vanished instantly. A moment later, Lupin felt his feet hit the ground. He drew his wand, looked up, and cautiously surveyed his surroundings. They stood in a dark, overgrown cemetery. To their right, a tall yew tree stood, and behind it, the dark outline of a small chapel. To their left was a hill, with a charming old house perched on its slope. Lupin looked around and called out, "Peter Pettigrew, are you here?" Peter emerged from behind a grave mound in the distance, excitedly exclaiming, "Gibbon, my old friend, did you bring Potter?" "Yes," Lupin said, pointing to Sirius beside him. "But Peter, what have I come all this way for? You said you'd give me 10,000 galleons for bringing you Potter, cash on delivery." Lupin pulled Sirius along, slowly moving forward, preparing to attack as they drew near. Just then, a cold voice suddenly rang out, "Kill him. He's not Gibbon." Peter's face paled. He immediately raised his wand and shouted, "Avada Kedavra!" A blinding green light shot towards Lupin. His nerves taut, he immediately pulled Sirius towards a nearby tombstone. A grave mound was struck by the killing curse, the mound exploding violently, scattering oil and dust. Stunned, Lupin raised his wand, shooting a red beam at Peter. Peter used Voldemort's father's grave as cover, retaliating. The three exchanged blows, and for a moment, the little Hangleton cemetery was filled with spells. Countless graves crumbling and exploding, leaving a scene of devastation. While dodging the magic, Peter whispered to the cauldron, "Master, let's go." "No," Voldemort roared, "kill that guy and bring Potter to me." Gibbon was an imposter, Voldemort was certain of that, but whether Potter was an imposter, he wasn't sure yet. What if it was the real Harry Potter, with resurrection so close? How could he possibly give up? Then I'll lure that guy away first, you be careful. Peter gritted his teeth and ran to the side. Peter's running away. I'll go after him, Lupin said urgently. Sirius, there's another dark wizard here, you deal with him, okay, be careful, don't let him get away. Sirius raised his wand and cautiously walked deeper into the graveyard. He traversed winding paths and soon found a broken grave with a stone cauldron filled with water in front of it, as if a potion was being brewed. Sirius circled the cauldron, then looked into the distance, preparing to continue searching for the strange wizard. Just then, a figure the size of an infant suddenly leaped out of the cauldron, like a venomous snake, and pounced on Sirius's back. Voldemort seized Sirius, opened his mouth, and bit down hard on his neck. Chapter 400 Rolf returns to the past. Sirius Black was instantly stunned by the sneak attack from behind. He had just searched the area, even glancing at the coffins and the graves to make sure there were no wizards there before leaving. He never imagined that a wizard would be hiding in that cauldron full of potions. What shocked him even more was that the attacker didn't use spells to attack him, but instead bit him. Was this a children's fight? Sirius reached out and grabbed the person behind him, but the creature's jaws were like a turtle's, biting his neck tightly and refusing to let go. Sirius had to pull hard, tearing off a large chunk of flesh, before finally freeing the attacker. He felt excruciating pain, and even the resilient Sirius cried out in agony. Sirius flung the attacker away violently. The creature's entire body crashed sideways into a tombstone, breaking it before collapsing to the ground like a rag doll. Sirius looked at the wizard who had been thrown away, his eyes widening as he stared at him, seemingly wondering and judging what this thing was. Resembling an infant in appearance, with dark red skin and a flat, snake-like face topped with a pair of gleaming red eyes, a daring thought suddenly flashed through Sirius's mind. You're Voldemort, it's me, Harry Potter. Voldemort, sprawled on the ground, his body a bloody mess, curled up in agony, then spat out a piece of flesh, his voice hoarse as he said, "We meet again, I'll kill you." Sirius didn't know how Voldemort had become like this, but he didn't care. His mind was consumed by the thought of avenging James and Lily. Sirius suddenly raised his wand, but his legs buckled, and he knelt on one knee. He took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and sweat quickly beaded on his forehead, blurring his vision. "Stop struggling," blood seeped from Voldemort's mouth, his eyes gleaming with madness as he cackled, "My teeth can secrete venom. Although I don't want to kill you this way, I'd use Avada Kedavra, but... Pot, you're dead." Sirius tried to raise his wand, but the poison had already paralyzed his entire body. He collapsed to the ground, blood gushing from the wound on his neck. With a snap, Peter apparated. Seeing the Dark Lord lying on the ground, he was horrified and rushed to pick him up. "Master, are you alright?" "I'm fine." Voldemort stared at Peter with his scarlet, cold eyes and asked, "Where's the wizard impersonating Gibbon?" "I lured that fellow into Riddle's old house." Peter wiped the large beads of sweat from his pale face and said, "There are traps set up there beforehand, they should hold him for a while." "Good. Quickly resurrect me." Voldemort's urgent voice was filled with excitement. "That piece of meat has Potter's blood on it. Quickly, put me in the cauldron." "Yes, Master." Peter picked up the bloodied meat. He carried Voldemort toward the stone cauldron, but saw a large bird fly straight toward them. It opened its beak and spat out a mouthful of orange flame. In an instant, the cauldron was ignited, and the heat wave scorched the corpse beside it, quickly surrounding it and turning it into wisps of ash. Peter's wand sprayed water onto the flames, but it had no effect. The phoenix's flames spread in all directions. Peter coughed as he carried Voldemort backward. Soon, Tom Riddle's grave, along with his remains, was engulfed in flames. "Fox," Voldemort roared furiously, "you damned wretch, daring to destroy my potion of resurrection. I'll tear you to pieces." Fox ignored Voldemort, flying straight to Sirius Black and standing beside him. Sirius Black, his chest heaving violently, was on the verge of death. He struggled to open his eyes, making meaningless wheezing and gurgling sounds. Fox blinked, and large, pearly tears rolled down his glossy feathers, landing on the back of his poisoned neck. Peter raised his wand, intending to attack Fox, but Voldemort shouted, "Quickly! Dumbledore is coming. Use the time turner to go back in time, back to before my father's grave was destroyed." "Yes, Master." Peter quickly pulled out the time turner, rapidly spinning it, and vanished into thin air with Voldemort. Deep within the Forbidden Forest, what was once a vast, lush forest had vanished, replaced by a massive crater the size of a lake. Ralph crouched at the bottom, watching the stone fall to the ground, shatter into pieces, the fragments bouncing back into the air, becoming whole again, only to fall and shatter once more. Clearly, the power of time was at play here. Dumbledore said it was caused by the time turner exploding. With a snap, a figure appeared beside Ralph. The boy looked up at the headmaster and asked, "Professor Dumbledore, how did the operation go?" "It failed." The old man shook his head. "Sirius and Remus failed to capture Peter. He escaped, though expected," Ralph said with a wry smile. "I still want to know, were they acting together, or were they impersonating Gibbon? How could Peter have escaped without any warning? The moment they appeared, Tom discovered Gibbon was an imposter," Dumbledore said softly. "How did Voldemort do that?" Ralph asked, puzzled. "He couldn't possibly have the ability to see through Polyjuice Potion, could he?" "I suspect it was the dark mark that gave it away," Dumbledore explained. "Gibbon is a Death Eater. He has the dark mark on his arm. Voldemort should be able to sense its presence in some way. But Remus, by using Polyjuice Potion to transform into Gibbon, couldn't create a genuine dark mark," Ralph sighed. "So Voldemort had an anti-counterfeiting mark after all. He hadn't expected such a small oversight to lead to his exposure. Typical Tom. Are they alright?" "Remus is fine, but Sirius was bitten by Voldemort and poisoned by his snake venom," Dumbledore said softly. "He almost died." "Is the position of defense against the dark arts professor really that cursed?" "Fortunately, they had fox feathers on them, and it quickly located them, rescuing Sirius in time," Dumbledore said. "They are not in mortal danger," Ralph sighed and said. "It seems I have to go back. There's no changing it." "Yes." Dumbledore drew his wand, pointed it at the ground, and said, "Time converter, come." A large pile of golden fragments, which had been scattered from the ground, gathered in midair. Dumbledore waved his magical old wand again and said, "Restore to its original state." The golden fragments instantly merged back together, restoring to their original state, and the power of time from the ground also arrived from afar, merging into the converter. Ralph took the time turner and asked, "Professor Dumbledore, there's something I don't understand. Why did Peter choose to go back to Halloween night last year? Why not some other time?" "Because you killed him that night. All the news reports said he died that night," Dumbledore smiled. "When Peter heard he was dead, whether it was true or not, he wanted to go back to Halloween night to find out what really happened and who really died. If possible, he wanted to save himself, just like he saved himself from the Aurors last year, but it was precisely this trip back that caused his death." Ralph narrowed his eyes. "He went to his death?" "That's right," Dumbledore nodded. "So those who manipulate time will inevitably be devoured by it." Ralph turned the time turner and asked, "Are you going back?" "No," Dumbledore shook his head. "I don't need to go back. My other self is already sitting in my office waiting for you. Be careful." Ralph waved his hand, and his figure vanished instantly. Thanks to Old Mo for the donation. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.